Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the long dark winters of the medieval world, a time when snow drifted over silent villages, when barns grew emptier by the week, and when survival itself often felt like a quiet negotiation with hunger. Medieval peasants were used to hardship, but when the harvest failed, and the frost lingered, the winter months became something far more than just cold nights. They became a season of famine. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what the weather feels like outside your own window tonight. It's always fascinating to see this little gathering stretch across so many places. Now dim the lights, maybe let the hum of the room fall into the background, and prepare to wander slowly through a season that tested the patience, faith and endurance of generations past. Tonight's journey begins with the final golden days of autumn, the last flicker of warmth before the long famine winter took hold. The medieval year turned slowly, not in sudden leaps, but in rhythms that every villager came to know with a kind of bodily certainty. Autumn did not arrive all at once, nor did it depart suddenly. It lingered in the gradual cooling of air, in the shortening of afternoons, in the mist that began to hover over fields at dawn. For medieval peasants, these days carried a mixture of relief and worry, of work completed and anxieties stirred anew. The harvest was gathered, the fields mostly stripped of grain, the last carts of sheaves hauled into barns. Yet the villagers knew that the season's ending meant more than just the turning of leaves. It meant the threshold of winter, and with it the great question of survival. Throughout much of Europe, the end of autumn was a season of ceaseless motion. Families turned their attention inward, to the careful gathering and storing of everything they had managed to draw from soil, orchard, or flock. Grain was the most vital, the very axis of life. Barley, oats, rye, and in wealthier regions, wheat was stored in wooden bins, clay jars, or woven baskets sealed with clay or dung to keep out rodents. These grains would be milled into flour and stretched into bread, the staple without which no household could endure the long frost. Grain harvests were notoriously precarious. A poor yield meant that winter would not merely be difficult, but possibly lethal. Alongside grain, there was the preservation of other foods. Salted meat hung from rafters, cured as best as possible in huts where smoke often lingered. Meat was never abundant for peasants. Most of what they had came from animals slaughtered in late autumn, when keeping them alive through winter was too costly in fodder. A cow or pig that could not be fed was more useful as salted flesh than as a living mouth to feed. Thus autumn slaughter was both a necessity and a grim ritual, a quiet acknowledgement that winter was not merely an absence of warmth, but an absence of life-sustaining abundance. Fish, where available, were salted or dried. In coastal or riverine communities, villagers labored in these weeks to catch and preserve as much as possible before the waters froze. Fish had religious as well as dietary significance, since medieval Christians often avoided meat on fasting days. In famine years, fish offered one of the few chances at sustenance beyond bread. Elsewhere, root vegetables were pulled from earth: turnips, onions, parsnips and leeks, each stored in pits dug into the ground and covered with straw and soil. These humble plants, often overlooked in times of plenty, would become the center of the diet when snow covered the land. Nuts, berries and wild fruits also had their place. Hazelnuts, acorns and chestnuts were collected by children and the elderly, their shells protecting them for long storage. Some were ground into coarse meals and mixed into bread when flour was scarce. Apples and pears were laid in straw, though many would rot long before spring. Honey too, if bees had been kept and tended, was harvested and sealed in earthen jars, its sweetness both a luxury and a preservative. The work of autumn was not only about food, but about preparation in a broader sense. Firewood was stacked carefully, often in large communal piles near cottages or barns. Without sufficient wood, the nights would be endured not merely in hunger, but in cold. Thatch on cottages was inspected, and patched against leaks, walls daubed with fresh clay to keep out the drafts. Clothing, woolen or linen, was mended or patched, knowing that new cloth would not be woven until spring labor eased. These acts of maintenance had a slow rhythm, unhurried but relentless, for each family understood that what was done in these last days would echo through the long months ahead. Despite the labors, autumn still carried moments of abundance, even of quiet celebration. Harvest festivals, linked to the church calendar, marked the completion of the year's work. Michaelmas in late September, Martinmas in November, and other local saints' days were often marked with small feasts, gatherings and prayers. Such occasions allowed peasants to briefly indulge in the richer foods of slaughter season: fresh meat, ale brewed from the summer's grain, and bread made from unmixed flour. Yet beneath the songs and prayers lay a muted apprehension, for everyone knew the line between festival and famine could be thin. The atmosphere of these weeks was one of careful counting, weighing and storing, but also of quiet uncertainty. Villagers remembered past winters vividly. They recalled years when the harvest had failed, when barns stood half empty before the snow even fell, when rats found their way into bins, when sickness thinned families before the spring thaw. Memory was as much a part of the harvest as the grain itself, shaping how each family judged its chances. For those bound to the land under feudal obligations, autumn also meant dues to their lords. Rents were often paid in kind, a portion of the harvest surrendered as wheat, barley, eggs or livestock. Tithes went to the church as well, a tenth of the yield in grain or produce. These demands often pressed heavily in years of scarcity. What was stored away for the manor or the parish was food that would not warm the stomachs of peasants. Yet refusal was rarely an option. Obligations were enforced, and hunger, though cruel, was less immediate than punishment. Thus the last days of autumn were marked not only by physical labor, but by an awareness of hierarchy and dependence. The lord's storehouses stood larger and more secure, the monastery's cellars deeper and cooler, while the peasants' bins and baskets were modest, often patched and vulnerable. Survival was not merely about what was harvested, but about what remained in one's possession after dues were met. The light itself seemed to shift in these weeks. Days grew shorter, nights stretched long, and the sun hung lower in the sky. The air carried a sharpness, the kind that whispered of frosts to come. Smoke from hearths rose more frequently into the air, drifting over thatched roofs and curling against the dimming sky. The sound of the flail on grain, the crack of axes splitting wood, and the calls of livestock being driven into pens filled the crisp air. It was in this atmosphere that peasants prepared, neither confident nor entirely resigned, but aware. The harvest was a season of gathering, but also of foreboding. Each loaf of bread stored, each salted cut of meat, each basket of turnips laid in the earth was not just food, but a hedge against the months when the world outside would turn silent, white, and unforgiving. As the final leaves fell from the trees and fields lay bare under the pale autumn sky, villages closed in upon themselves, their energy shifting from outward work to inward waiting. The days of labor in the fields were ending, and the long season of endurance was about to begin. The last days of autumn carried with them a heavy stillness, as though the earth itself was pausing to draw breath before the long exhale of winter famine. The final days of autumn slipped into something quieter, heavier, and far less forgiving. At first, the change was subtle, a thin glaze of ice on the water pails, left outside overnight, a shimmer on the grass that crunched faintly underfoot, the pale mist that hovered over the village commons until well after sunrise. By mid-morning it would melt away, but each new dawn seemed to hold the frost a little longer, to let it cling to the earth with a firmness that spoke of the deeper cold to come. The first frost marked more than just a change of temperature. For the medieval peasant, it was a kind of boundary, an invisible line that separated one season's tasks from the next. The fields were now dormant, their soil hardened, unresponsive to the hand or the plough. Whatever had been gathered, stored or preserved, now stood as the measure of survival, for the world outside had ceased to be generous. The grain in the bins, the salted meat in the rafters, the roots in the earth pits, these were no longer simply provisions, they were the only provisions. The frost had quietly closed the door on growth, on renewal, on the chance of replenishment. It was in these mornings that rivers began to slow, their edges crusted with ice that thickened day by day. For villagers who relied on streams for water, washing, or even milling, This gradual freezing was not merely a curiosity of weather, but a reminder that nature itself was sealing shut its usual pathways. Mills powered by water could grind grain only as long as the streams flowed freely. Once ice locked them, milling slowed or ceased, forcing households to make do with hand querns smaller and slower. The frost, therefore, was not only a sensory change, but a signal that every convenience, every routine of life, would soon be reduced to its hardest and most basic form. Snow often followed close behind the first frost. Sometimes it fell as a fine dusting that powdered rooftops and hedgerows, barely more than a whitening of the ground. At other times it arrived thick and heavy, blanketing cottages, barns and lanes in silence. Snow muffled sound, dulled color, and gave the countryside a sameness that blurred the familiar boundaries of fields and paths. For the peasant, snow was beautiful only at a distance. Up close it was an obstacle, a hazard that made every journey slower, every task harder, every firewood trip colder. Its whiteness was not purity but emptiness, concealing the earth that no longer offered food until spring. As the frost deepened, the village itself seemed to shrink into stillness. Outdoor work became rarer, limited to the essential tasks of tending animals and fetching fuel. Carts were pulled less often, fields were walked less frequently. The air carried fewer sounds of labor and more of silence. Only the caw of crows, the crack of ice on a pond, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Inside, life centered on the hearth. Smoke drifted steadily from chimneys, marking where human presence fought against the creeping cold. The hearth was no longer only for cooking. It became the axis of life, a place to huddle, to mend tools, to speak quietly, to wait for the light to return. Food, from this moment onward, was understood in a new light. Bread, porridge and pottage were measured carefully, their portions considered against the length of the season ahead. The first frost had closed the world, and each meal now came with the awareness that it diminished a finite store. What had been gathered in autumn might last, but it might not, and the difference often hinged on the harshness of the coming months. In milder years, the stores could stretch with little suffering. In harder winters, when snow lay thick and ice lingered long, the reckoning was more severe. The recognition of this finitude cast a quiet shadow across the village. The people were not strangers to hunger, but each frost rekindled old memories of lean years. Elders recalled past winters when stores failed, when bread was baked with ground bark or pea husks, when illness struck weakened families. Younger folk, though they might not remember such years directly, had inherited the stories, and stories themselves acted as warnings. The frost was thus not only an environmental threshold, but a psychological one. It signaled that the time of testing had begun, the period when survival was stripped of abundance and left bare in its essentials. Animals too bore the mark of this transition. Cattle and sheep were brought into barns or lean-tos, their breath rising in clouds within the dim spaces where straw was spread to give some warmth. Feeding them required careful rationing of hay and fodder gathered in summer. For smaller households, the choice was harsh: which animals to keep through winter, and which to slaughter before they consumed too much precious feed. Chickens might be left to scavenge until snow buried the ground, at which point they too would demand grain that was otherwise destined for human mouths. The frost made every creature into a competitor for survival, and each day forced households to balance compassion against necessity. Travel, once common across fields and lanes, slowed drastically. Frost-hardened paths might be easier for carts than muddy autumn roads, but the deeper the cold grew, the more uncertain travel became. Frozen rivers could collapse under weight, snowdrifts could conceal hazards, and night fell too quickly to make journeys safe. The frost therefore acted as a kind of enclosure, binding villages into their own isolation. Communication with neighboring settlements waned, and the sense of being cut off deepened. What one household had, it would have to make do with. What one village lacked, it might not be able to replace. Religious life took on an added dimension during this season. The church bells, still ringing across frost-shrouded mornings, reminded villagers of the cycle of saints' days and the approaching Advent season. Sermons often interpreted the frost and the barrenness of winter as reminders of divine order, trials set by God to encourage patience, humility, and faith. The stillness of winter nights seemed almost monastic, aligning ordinary peasants with the austerity of monks. Hunger in this sense was not only a bodily experience but also a spiritual lesson, framed as both punishment for human sin and preparation for heavenly endurance. The frost also reshaped the landscape in ways that marked memory. Children would remember the sparkle of frozen mornings, the way ponds cracked under thrown stones, the muffled hush of snowfall. Adults remembered less the beauty and more the weight, the cracking of frozen wood, the pain of numb fingers, the long hours spent conserving candles and fire. To live through frost was to accept a double truth. The world was beautiful in its severity, and the same severity threatened life at every turn. As weeks passed, the frost deepened into certainty. By December, rivers ran silent under sheets of ice, and snow lay crusted over the fields, where stubble of the last harvest still poked faintly through. The first frost had been only the beginning, a whisper of what was to come. Now it was a blanket that covered everything, a silence that pressed down on barns, cottages, and the human stomach alike. The villagers looked at their stores, at the dimming sun, and at the lengthening shadows of each day, and they understood that the world had closed itself tightly until spring. And so, the season of waiting began in earnest. The first frost was no longer just a marker of time, but the seal of a long confinement. From now until the thaw, life would move within narrow limits, bound to the measure of food that remained, the warmth of the hearth, and the endurance of the body. Each day would draw from a store that did not replenish. Each meal would be weighed against the unknown length of the cold. This silent reckoning would grow sharper still in the weeks to follow, when the first faint signs of hunger began to creep into daily life. By the time the frost had settled fully into the landscape, daily life within the medieval village began to contract inward. What had once been a rhythm of field work, of open air and shared labor under the sun, narrowed into the smaller world of the cottage, the barn, and the few steps that separated them. The frost outside did not immediately bring famine, but it did bring limitation, and within that limitation, families reshaped their habits, conserving strength and supplies alike. A medieval peasant household was not large in space. Cottages were built of timber frames, daubed with wattle and clay, and roofed in thatch that often sagged under the weight of snow. Floors were generally of packed earth, swept but never warm. The interior space was usually a single room, sometimes divided by partitions, sometimes not. In one corner a hearth burned low, its smoke drifting upward through a hole or a crude chimney. Around it clustered benches, stools, or a rough table. Beds, when they existed, were platforms of wood or rope frames strung with straw mattresses. Children often slept together on pallets of hay near the warmth of animals in the adjoining byre. Within such a dwelling, organization took on heightened importance during the winter months. Food storage was not abundant enough to allow for disorder. Grain was kept in bins, wooden chests, or sacks, sometimes hung from beams to keep out vermin. Root vegetables were buried in straw or stored in cool, dry corners. Salted meat hung overhead, out of reach of dogs and children, while small crocks of butter, cheese, or lard were tucked away where the cold would keep them longer. Every item had its place, not because peasants were obsessively tidy, but because the difference between order and waste could mean the difference between endurance and hunger. Livestock were central to winter life, both as resources and as responsibilities. Cattle, sheep, and goats were housed in barns or under lean-to roofs attached to cottages. Their body heat helped warm the structure, but their upkeep was costly. Each day demanded fodder, hay, or turnips, drawn from the stores that might otherwise feed people. Families calculated constantly which animals to keep and which to slaughter. A cow was precious for milk, but if hay ran thin, she could quickly become a liability. Chickens provided eggs in milder winters, though cold could still the laying altogether. Pigs, opportunistic feeders, might be fattened on scraps, but their feed still came at a price. The stable and the barn were places of as much calculation as care, each decision a weighing of the present need against the future cost. Daily routines reflected the balance between activity and conservation. Morning began late compared to summer, as light arrived only after long stretches of darkness. Fires were stirred from embers, bread was eaten cold or warmed on the hearth, and animals were tended before much else. Children might fetch water from a nearby well, breaking the ice at its surface, or carry bundles of wood back to the cottage. Women often spent the dim hours mending clothing, spinning thread, or patching worn shoes, tasks that accumulated when outdoor work ceased. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, or worked at carving or simple joinery, knowing that spring labor would demand implements in good order. These tasks filled the days, but not with the same sense of urgency as harvest or planting seasons. Winter tasks were quieter, more repetitive, more about keeping things in motion than driving them forward. Meals, modest at the best of times, became carefully managed rituals. Breakfasts were small, sometimes only bread and ale, taken after the morning's animal care. Midday meals centered on pottage, a simmering mixture of grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables remained. Meat, if it appeared at all, was in small pieces, often to flavor rather than to satisfy. Supper repeated the same pattern, and the monotony of diet was rarely broken except on feast days or special occasions. Yet even in this monotony, there was strategy. Broths were stretched with water, bread with bran, cheese with herbs, all to make stores last a little longer. The anxiety of scarcity hovered in these daily routines. Families did not speak constantly of hunger, but they measured it in quiet ways. The speed with which grain disappeared from the bin, the level of hay in the loft, the rate at which salted meat dwindled. Each glance at a larder or storehouse carried with it a silent calculation. How many weeks until Candlemas? How many months until the thaw? Would the stores last if snow lingered until April, as it sometimes did? Memory of past winters sharpened these calculations. The old might recall the famine of 1315, 1317, when rain ruined crops and hunger stalked whole regions of Europe. Such memories did not fade easily. They returned each winter as cautions, reminders that nature and fortune could be pitiless. Religion, too, was woven into this waiting. The church calendar structured the weeks, reminding villagers that Advent was a season of patience and restraint. Sermons linked daily hunger with spiritual discipline, framing the hardships of winter as parallels to the trials of Christ or the saints. The anxiety of scarcity was thus given a theological shape. It was not merely bad luck or mismanagement, but a divine test. Some peasants took comfort in this framing, others only resignation. But in either case it infused daily life with meaning beyond the physical. Social bonds within the village also mattered greatly. Neighbors might share tools, exchange small amounts of food, or lend a hand with animals. Such gestures were not only kindness but strategy. For one household's survival often depended on the goodwill of others. Yet anxiety also bred suspicion. A barn too full, a store too generous, might provoke whispers of hoarding or unfair advantage. Winter tightened communities, but it also strained them, revealing the lines between cooperation and competition. The daily life before true scarcity, then, was a mixture of ordinary rhythms and unspoken worry. Tasks went on, fires were tended, animals fed, bread baked, clothing mended, but beneath these motions was the steady pulse of calculation. How much was left? How much could be spared? How much longer must it last? This was the quiet backdrop against which the frost deepened and the snow thickened. It was a time not yet of famine, but of anticipation, of the uneasy knowledge that the line between sufficiency and hunger was never far away. And when the first signs of hunger began to press themselves into daily life, when bread had to be stretched thinner, and pottage watered more than before, the villagers would find themselves moving from careful management into true scarcity, where the choices became starker and the days heavier. The days of measured meals and careful rationing passed slowly, and through the muffled quiet of the snow-covered village, one sound remained steady, the tolling of the church bells. Their notes rose above the thatched rooftops and drifted across the fields, muted by frost and mist, yet distinct enough to draw people from their cottages. In the medieval world, the church was not a building set apart from daily life, but the very axis around which life revolved, especially in the long, uncertain months of winter. The bells marked time, calling villagers to Mass, to Vespers, to feast days and saints' vigils. In the absence of clocks, They ordered the rhythms of the day, reminding people when to pause from their work or when to gather in prayer. In winter, when daylight hours were short and indoor confinement bred monotony, the church's calendar took on an even greater importance. Advent, with its emphasis on waiting and preparation, mirrored perfectly the villagers' own state of endurance. Each Sunday was not just another day of dwindling stores, but a milestone on the long journey towards spring. The interior of the church itself offered a sharp contrast to the cottages of the village. Stone walls rose high, their coolness unsoftened by fire, for most parish churches were not heated. Floors were of earth or stone, the air often damp with the breath of many gathered bodies. Yet to the peasant, this was not a place of discomfort, but of solemnity. The cold inside the church was accepted as part of its sanctity, a reminder that earthly life was never meant to be entirely comfortable. Candles flickered along altars, their light dim but steady, illuminating painted saints or carved crucifixes. The scent of beeswax and incense lingered faintly, carrying associations of the sacred even into the darkest season. Here, sermons shaped how villagers understood their hunger and their waiting. Priests spoke of famine, cold, and hardship as trials permitted by God, lessons in humility and patience. The lack of food was framed not merely as misfortune, but as divine pedagogy, a way to remind humanity of its dependence on heaven. Biblical stories of Joseph, storing grain in Egypt, or of Christ fasting in the wilderness, were invoked as mirrors of peasant experience. To hunger, the priest explained, was to share in the sufferings of the saints, to be tested like Job, to be refined like gold in the furnace. For many, these interpretations were not merely consolations but frameworks that gave meaning to their struggle. Hunger was not pointless, but purposeful. The scarcity of bread could be endured if it was understood as a participation in a divine mystery. The rhythm of Mass, with its ritual repetition, carried the villagers through weeks that otherwise blurred together. Each liturgical gesture, the raising of the host, the sign of the cross, the recitation of prayers, was a reminder that the villagers' suffering was not unseen. Yet the church was more than a spiritual interpreter. It was also a place of material aid, however limited. Tithes collected in grain or produce were sometimes redistributed during lean years, either through parish charity or by direct almsgiving from wealthier households at the priest's encouragement. The monastery, where one existed nearby, often played an even larger role, for its granaries and cellars were deeper, its discipline stricter, its resources more reliable. In famine years, monasteries might open their doors to the hungry, offering bread at the gate, though never in endless supply. These acts of charity were not purely benevolent, they reinforced the church's moral authority and bound the poor to its protection. But for the villagers who received them, they could be the difference between survival and despair. The bells also called people together in ways that reinforced community during the isolating months of winter. Feasts of saints, even when modestly observed, offered a break from monotony. Candlemas in early February, with its blessing of candles and processions of light, reminded villagers that the darkness would eventually lift. The Feast of St. Martin in November, the Feast of St. Nicholas in December, and the Christmas season itself were moments when even amidst scarcity, communal rituals could renew hope. In these gatherings, villagers did not merely endure side by side, but wove themselves into a shared story of endurance. Confession, too, carried particular weight in winter, when hunger pressed and tempers shortened, when the temptation to hoard or to resent one's neighbors grew strong. The sacrament offered a way to unburden guilt and restore social harmony. Priests reminded parishioners that sin could be as corrosive as hunger, that envy or theft could destroy a village as surely as famine. In this way, the Church's moral authority helped regulate behavior in times when scarcity might otherwise fracture communities. The soundscape of the village in winter was thus defined as much by the bells as by the crackle of hearth fires or the lowing of cattle. Morning bells called peasants to prayer before tending their animals. Evening bells marked the day's close. Special peals for feast days punctuated the monotony, adding texture to the long weeks. Even funerals, sadly more frequent during famine years, were announced by tolling that echoed across snow-covered fields, reminding everyone of mortality and of the Church's central role in shepherding souls through life and death alike. Not all found comfort in these rituals. Some, weakened by hunger or embittered by loss, may have listened to sermons about divine testing with quiet skepticism. When the stomach gnawed and children cried, the insistence that suffering was holy could ring hollow. Yet, even for those who doubted, the Church remained unavoidable. To refuse its framework was to stand outside the community itself, and in the medieval world, such isolation was rarely survivable. The bells called everyone, believer and skeptic alike, to stand together beneath the same stone roof, to listen to the same words, to participate in the same cycle of waiting. As the frost thickened into deep winter, and the snow lay unmoved on the frozen fields, the bells seemed to grow heavier in sound, their resonance slower, deeper, as though carrying the weight of the season itself. Each toll reminded villagers that time continued, even when the land lay still, that days passed, weeks turned, and eventually, the wheel of the year would turn again towards spring. The bells did not dispel hunger, but they gave it shape. They did not banish scarcity, but they framed it within a story of divine order. And yet, outside the church walls, hunger was beginning to creep more insistently into daily life. Meals grew thinner, meat rarer, bread stretched further than before. The anxiety that had lingered as a background hum was slowly becoming a sharper note, pressing itself into every conversation and every calculation. As the bells rang on in their steady rhythm, the first unmistakable signs of scarcity began to press themselves upon the village. When the bells faded back into silence and the villagers returned from the church to their cottages, the outward world remained unchanged. The same blanket of snow over the fields, the same hard frost clinging to thatch and timber. Yet, as December deepened into January, the landscape itself began to shift in ways that carried a more profound consequence than even the sermons could frame. Roads that had been difficult in autumn rains became nearly impassable, covered in thick ice and drifting snow. Streams and rivers, once reliable channels for travel and commerce, hardened into glittering sheets of frozen stillness. Gradually, the village began to fold in upon itself, cut off from the tenuous threads of connection that once tied it to the wider world. Medieval roads had never been smooth avenues of travel, even in summer. They were little more than dirt tracks, carved by generations of carts and hooves, prone to ruts, puddles, and mire. In winter, these imperfections were magnified into obstacles. Snow drifted across the way, obscuring familiar landmarks. Ice turned ruts into treacherous traps for wooden wheels. Those who attempted to travel risked slipping, overturning, or becoming stranded in a landscape where help was rarely close at hand. A journey of a few miles could stretch into an ordeal, and most peasants simply stayed put, retreating further into the protective orbit of their hamlets. Rivers, too, changed their nature. For much of the year, they were the lifeblood of movement, carrying barges of grain, fish, or salt, connecting villages to markets and markets to towns. But when the frost seized them, they ceased to flow. Ice locked their surfaces, sometimes strong enough to bear the weight of men, carts, or even animals, but always unpredictable, always dangerous. In some regions, frozen rivers became makeshift roads, and markets were held upon their icy surfaces, as famously recorded on the Thames centuries later. But in the smaller villages of northern and central Europe, these freezes more often meant silence. Boats were pulled ashore, nets hung up, and the steady rhythm of river trade came to a standstill. The isolation that followed was not only physical but psychological. The knowledge that no merchant's cart would be arriving, that no news would come from beyond the frozen fields, pressed heavily on communities already wary of scarcity. Trade routes dwindled, and with them, the chance of replenishing dwindling stores. Salt fish from the coast, grain from more fertile regions, or cloth from nearby towns. All of these became uncertain luxuries, their absence a reminder that the village must now survive on its own reserves. The effect was not uniform across Europe. In areas near larger towns, the disruption was less severe, for lords or monasteries maintained better roads and held deeper stores. But in more remote villages, the sense of enclosure grew acute. A peasant family might have relatives only a few miles away, yet weeks could pass without contact, for snow and ice made the journey perilous. Illness, accident, or sudden hunger could strike in silence, with no neighbor aware until the thaw allowed paths to reopen. In this sense, famine was not merely about food but about the slow unspooling of human connection. Traveling officials too grew scarce. Bailiffs collecting rents or sheriffs enforcing law found their circuits delayed, sometimes postponed until spring. For peasants, this absence was double-edged. On the one hand, fewer demands meant a reprieve from external burdens. On the other, the absence of oversight also meant a weakening of protection, leaving villagers to manage disputes and dangers on their own. In such conditions, the church often became the only reliable point of contact with a wider authority, its bells carrying further than footsteps could. Merchants and peddlers, who once brought not only goods but stories of other places, disappeared from the frozen landscape. In their absence, imagination filled the silence. Villagers speculated about conditions in nearby towns, about whether famine was widespread or uniquely theirs. Some hoped that beyond the frozen rivers, supplies remained abundant. Others feared that the entire world was similarly locked in hunger and cold. The lack of news created a fertile ground for rumor, often shaped by sermons into tales of divine punishment or heavenly trial. The isolation deepened hunger's sting. When food ran low in the autumn, there had always been the possibility, however slim, that more might be obtained through trade. But with the freezing of roads and rivers, this possibility dwindled into near impossibility. The barns now represented not only what was left but all that there would be until spring. Each bag of grain, each side of bacon, each jar of beans was counted with a sharper eye, for resupply was no longer an option. The psychological weight of that knowledge pressed harder than the snow itself. Yet within the stillness, life continued in muted rhythms. Paths between cottages were trodden firmly into the snow, connecting hearth to hearth. Children played upon frozen ponds, their laughter carrying through the frosty air, a reminder that even famine did not extinguish all joy. Hunters ventured cautiously into the forests, though game was scarce and dangerous in winter. Women fetched water from ice-crusted wells, their breath clouding in the morning cold. In every act, the frozen world demanded more effort, more resilience, more acceptance that survival itself was the day's labor. Still, the memory of movement lingered. Villagers recalled autumn markets where they had traded for wool or iron tools, where the bustle of voices had filled the square. Now, the silence of the frozen road reminded them that those gatherings were far away, perhaps impossibly distant until spring. The winter locked them not only in their hunger, but in their imaginations, narrowing their horizon to the handful of cottages and fields they could see from their doorsteps. As the roads and rivers remained sealed under frost, the inward focus of the village grew sharper. People leaned more heavily on one another, on the rhythms of church bells, on the slow rationing of stores. But alongside solidarity came tension. Hoarding became more visible, for no trade could disguise excess. Envy grew sharper, for no merchant's arrival could soften disparity. The frozen roads thus hardened more than the land. They hardened the lines of dependence, rivalry and suspicion that lay quietly within any human settlement. And so, as winter settled into its deepest weeks, the village existed like an island, encircled, not by water, but by snow and ice, cut off from all but itself. Hunger pressed harder, days shortened further, and the bells continued their steady rhythm. Yet within cottages, as the last embers of the fire glowed red, families counted their stores again and again, aware that the real struggle had only just begun. The snow lay heavy still, muffling the sounds of the village, and sealing it in quiet. The bells rang on, the roads and rivers remained closed, and within each cottage the rhythm of daily life became smaller, more tightly focused around the fire, the barn, and the pantry. It was in these pantries, wooden chests, earthen jars and rough-hewn bins, that the next chapter of the famine revealed itself. For it was here that families began to notice, with creeping unease, that their careful preparations were thinning more quickly than they had hoped. At first, the recognition was subtle. A mother reaching into the grain bin found her hand brushing its bottom sooner than expected. A man cutting bacon noticed that the side hanging in the rafters seemed lighter, the layer of fat thinner. Children, once given scraps freely, now waited longer between offerings, their parents quietly recalculating how far each morsel could be stretched. It was not yet starvation, not yet desperation, but the unmistakable whisper of hunger had begun to thread itself into daily life. Meals, once modest but sufficient, were the first to change. Bread, the cornerstone of medieval diet, was baked in smaller loaves, its flour stretched with peas, beans or chestnuts ground into coarse meal. What had once been hearty and filling became thin, dark, and brittle. In years of plenty, bread might be eaten with meat, cheese or dripping. In the famine winter it was consumed alone, each slice carefully divided. The act of breaking bread, so central to family and faith alike, became not a symbol of abundance but of restraint. Pottage, that constant simmering mixture of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat, also changed in character. Broths grew thinner, flavored more by water than by fat or marrow. Where once cabbage, leeks or beans might bulk it out, now scraps and peelings were added in their place. In some cottages, a single pot stretched across multiple days, each reheating producing a weaker and paler dish. Hunger was not yet gnawing, but it had begun its slow education in disappointment. Food was still there, but it was less satisfying, less sustaining, less frequent. Rationing became a quiet ritual. Parents, often mothers, measured grain with a careful hand, not only for the day but for the weeks and months still to come. A handful of beans withheld today might mean the difference between endurance and collapse come February. Children were taught to eat more slowly, to chew carefully, to learn the discipline of small portions. In some households, a single meal a day replaced two, with only bread or ale sops to break the long hours in between. The act of eating, once a simple matter, became a negotiation with time itself. How much could be consumed now without sacrificing the future? The livestock, too, mirrored this tightening economy. Cows and goats still gave milk, but less than before, for their fodder was also stretched thin. Sheep, useful for wool, as well as meat, were often spared slaughter unless absolutely necessary. Pigs, which could be fattened quickly in better times, were fewer now, their grain feed too costly to maintain. Chickens, scavenging in the frozen yard, produced fewer eggs. Thus the cycle of scarcity extended from pantry to barn, tightening around the village like a slowly drawn cord. The body responded in its own quiet way. Bellies that once felt comfortably full, now settled into a state of constant half-hunger. Energy waned. Tasks in the fields, barns or woods seemed to take longer, requiring more effort for less return. Children grew pale and thinner, their cheeks hollowing, though still they played in the snow, unaware of the long road that lay ahead. The elderly felt the change most keenly, their weakened bodies less able to endure long stretches without nourishment. Hunger announced itself not with drama, but with weariness, with sighs, with the quiet slowness of movements. These first signs of hunger also bred unease. In the silence of the night, families whispered their worries. Had they miscalculated the harvest? Had too much been eaten too quickly during the festive days of Christmas? Would the stores last until spring? Each family's anxiety was private, yet all shared the same experience, creating a kind of unspoken solidarity across the cottages. They did not speak of hunger openly, for to name it was to give it power, but each household knew the others were making the same small sacrifices. The church's sermons, which once seemed lofty, now acquired sharper resonance. When priests spoke of fasting, villagers thought not of spiritual discipline, but of necessity. When the Eucharist was celebrated, the sight of bread broken on the altar carried echoes of the thin loaves at home. Hunger reframed the sacred, as much as the sacred reframed hunger, weaving the two together into a single experience of endurance. Yet, alongside faith, calculation continued. Each family became its own accountant, balancing jars of beans, bins of barley, and flitches of bacon against the long march of weeks ahead. Every crumb mattered, every morsel carried weight. The pantry was no longer a place of comfort, but of constant reckoning, where the sound of a lid lifted or a chest opened carried with it a note of worry. Even children came to understand that asking for food was asking for something finite, something that might not be there tomorrow. Still, life carried on with its rhythms. Fires were lit, animals tended, prayers recited. Hunger had not yet broken the community's strength, it had only begun to shadow it. There was hope, even now, that the stores might last, that the thaw might come early, that fortune might yet intervene. But beneath that hope, in the quiet scraping of spoons against bowls and the measured slicing of bread, the reality was clear. The famine had begun not with emptiness, but with less, and less, carried forward day by day, was already changing everything. The thin meals and shrinking stores inside the cottages were mirrored by an equal emptiness outside, in the places where trade had once breathed some life into the winter months. In the medieval village, the market was not merely a square for exchange, it was a vital artery, a place where the quiet routines of household and field opened outward into connection with others. There, the farmer's surplus might be bartered for salt, or a housewife's woven cloth traded for a little dried fish from a traveling peddler. But as the winter famine deepened, these gatherings began to shrink, until their absence became as noticeable as the rumbling of an empty stomach. Our markets in medieval Europe were regulated affairs, often granted by charter, set on fixed days when villagers from surrounding hamlets would converge upon a central green or open yard. In good years, they were lively, noisy places, filled with the cries of sellers and the bustle of buyers, a break in the monotony of rural life. Even in winter, though smaller than in summer, markets still provided a point of contact, a chance to exchange news, gossip, and goods. But famine gnawed away at that rhythm. Surpluses, the very fuel of trade, simply no longer existed. The harvest had been poor, the stores already thinning, and each family now clung tightly to what little remained. Grain, once measured out for sale, or barter, was withheld. Animals, once brought for market, were kept at home, their survival more valuable than the coins they might fetch. Even small luxuries, honey, ale, or cheese, that might once have been sold in modest quantity, were now reserved for the household itself. The stalls that had once displayed such goods grew fewer and fewer, until the marketplace itself began to feel abandoned, a skeleton of its former self. The silence of these empty markets carried a weight that went beyond the absence of goods. It was a silence of connection lost. Villagers no longer saw their neighbors from outlying hamlets, no longer heard tidings of nearby towns. Merchants, those bearers of faraway goods and distant stories, ceased to arrive. Without their presence, not only salt and fish, but also news of prices, politics, or distant harvests vanished. The famine thus isolated, not only stomachs but imaginations, shrinking horizons until the world seemed reduced to the snowbound cottages alone. Barter, that most ancient form of exchange, also collapsed in the face of scarcity. In better times, families might trade a sack of barley for a sheepskin, or a measure of beans for a little lamp oil. But when barley and beans were rationed down to the handful, such exchanges lost their possibility. Who would part with what they could not replace? Even those with goods to trade found no willing partners, for hunger made every family its own fortress, guarding supplies jealously. The spirit of exchange that markets relied upon gave way to suspicion, envy, and secrecy. The economic life of the village thus withdrew further inward into the realm of necessity. Tasks were performed only for the household itself. Looms clacked not for market cloth, but for garments to ward off the cold. Ale was brewed in smaller, weaker quantities, consumed at home rather than sold. What little production remained was turned toward survival, not exchange. The once social act of trade gave way to solitary endurance. This decline was not without consequence for the lord of the manor or the broader feudal system. Markets had always been a source of income, through tolls, fees, and fines. Their emptiness meant lost revenue, which in turn strained the already tenuous relations between lord and peasant. Lords might attempt to demand payments in kind rather than in coin, but even here, the shortage meant compliance was difficult. Some peasants fell into arrears, debts mounting silently until the thaw came. For now, however, these tensions remained muted, overshadowed by the more immediate need to survive. Yet even amidst emptiness, the market square retained its symbolic place. People still gathered, if only sparsely, drawn less by the expectation of goods than by habit, or by the need to see if others fared better or worse. A few peddlers still appeared, hawking scraps of cloth, rusted tools, or other odds and ends. Some may have carried food from regions less afflicted, but their prices were beyond the reach of most peasants. In famine years, markets often became places where hunger was most visible, gaunt faces, thin bodies, the hush of resignation where once there had been bargaining. The collapse of trade also deepened the sense of time suspended. Without the weekly rhythm of market day, the calendar of the village grew even more monotonous, marked only by church bells and the turning of the liturgical seasons. Winter already slowed life to a crawl, but the loss of markets erased one of the few interruptions that gave it texture. The silence of the square echoed the silence of the frozen roads and rivers, each reinforcing the other in a feedback loop of isolation. For children, the emptiness was perhaps the strangest of all. Markets had once been places of wonder, the sight of new objects, the taste of unfamiliar food, the chance to see faces from beyond the village. Now those journeys ended in disappointment, with only bare stalls and quiet voices. They too learned the lesson of famine, that the world itself seemed to contract, offering less and less with each passing week. And yet, as hunger pressed and trade receded, villagers adapted in quiet ways. Old tools were mended rather than replaced. Clothes were patched and repatched. A broken pot was not discarded, but bound with metal staples. These acts of improvisation were the domestic shadow of the vanished marketplace, reminders that when external exchange failed, internal resourcefulness became essential. The absence of trade forced a turn inward, to making do with what was already at hand. The empty marketplace thus stood as both a symptom and a symbol of famine. It revealed the collapse of surplus, the suspension of exchange, and the shrinking of horizons. It was a silence that mirrored the rumbling stomachs at home, a hollowness that paralleled the thinning loaves of bread. The famine was no longer a private matter of household stores, but a collective reality visible in the abandoned square, in the missing merchants, in the untraded goods. And as villagers returned from the empty square to their cottages, the realization deepened that hunger was no longer an inconvenience, but a season unto itself, one that reshaped not only bodies and pantries, but also the very structure of communal life. The silence of the marketplace, like the silence of the frozen rivers, was only the beginning of the famine's tightening grip. The silence of the empty marketplace pressed heavily upon the villagers, and with it came the slow realization that survival could no longer depend on familiar rhythms of exchange. The loaves at home grew smaller, the pottage thinner, and every cupboard seemed hollow. Where once a family could look to neighbors, to merchants, or to the square itself for relief, now there was only the land, silent, frozen, and indifferent. And so, in the depth of winter, men, women, and even children turned their eyes to the forest, the hedgerow, and the snow-covered fields, seeking sustenance where no one had thought to look in times of abundance. Foraging was not foreign to medieval life. In every season, peasants supplemented their diets with what nature offered: berries in summer, mushrooms in autumn, nuts gathered before the frost. These foods were never central to survival, but they added flavor and variety. In famine, however, the relationship with the land changed drastically. Foraging was no longer a pleasant addition, but a grim necessity, and the things gathered were not sweet fruits or tender greens, but the hard, bitter, and often barely edible gifts of a frozen countryside. The snow made every step heavier, every search more difficult. Paths that in summer led to familiar groves or streams now disappeared under drifts, leaving only guesswork and memory. Still, villagers ventured out, wrapped in patched cloaks and bound straw around their feet, prodding frozen earth with sticks, scraping bark from trees and digging through icy crusts in the hope of finding roots. The first targets were acorns, lying hidden beneath the snowdrifts in the oak groves. In ordinary years, pigs were driven into these same woods to feed on acorns and beech mast, fattening before slaughter. But now, without pigs to harvest them, or with swine already butchered for lack of fodder, the acorns themselves became food for humans. Raw, they were bitter, and even poisonous if consumed in quantity. The villagers, however, remembered old methods: boiling, leaching them in running water, pounding them into a coarse flour. The resulting bread was dark, heavy, and unpleasant, yet it gave a sense of fullness. Families sat around the hearth chewing the bitter loaves, grateful at least for the illusion of eating. Bark, too, became food. Children followed their parents into the woods, scraping the inner layers of pine, birch, or elm, peeling back the rough outer shell to reveal the softer cambium beneath. It could be dried and ground into powder, or boiled into thin porridge. Such bark bread, known in many famine-struck regions across Europe, had the consistency of leather and little nourishment, but it kept death at bay. Birch was favoured for its faint sweetness, though in truth, the substance gave little beyond bulk. Eating bark left the mouth dry and the stomach unsettled, yet it became common enough that villagers would carry home bundles of stripped wood, as if logs themselves had been transformed into a strange, desperate harvest. Nettles and other wild greens were also sought. Even in winter, some hardy plants lingered beneath the snow or near the edges of running water. Families dug through frost to find nettles, chickweed or sorrel, all of which could be boiled into soups. In better seasons, these herbs had been considered peasant fare, eaten by the poor when bread ran out, while the wealthier scoffed at them. Now, even those with pride had no choice. A pot of nettle broth, steaming faintly on the hearth, gave the household a fleeting sense of comfort, though the thin green water did little to strengthen failing bodies. Moss, lichens, and even roots became part of the foraging. Some lichens, when boiled several times to remove bitterness, could be eaten. Certain roots, wild carrots, burdock, or dandelion, might be dug from the frozen ground if one was patient and lucky. Yet many of these plants carried risks. Mistaken identity was deadly. A root that looked like parsnip might prove poisonous hemlock. A handful of mushrooms uncovered in thawing earth might bring sickness rather than sustenance. In famine years, such mistakes were common, whispered about in hushed tones when a family suddenly fell ill after a desperate meal. The forest, once a place of danger or mystery in medieval imagination, now became both lifeline and threat. Wolves roamed more boldly in famine years, driven closer to human dwellings by the same scarcity that plagued the villagers. Foraging parties sometimes carried sticks or axes, both for scraping bark and for defense. Tales spread of travelers vanishing in the woods, not from wolves alone, but from exhaustion, slipping into the snow and never rising again. Hunger dulled judgment. Feet stumbled, breath grew shallow. To forage was to risk life in pursuit of life, a cruel cycle with no guarantee of success. Yet even in this bleak scavenging, there was a rhythm, a communal knowledge passed down through generations. Older women remembered which trees gave the most edible bark, which herbs could survive under frost, how to leach bitterness from acorns. Children learned quickly, their small hands better suited to digging beneath snowbanks or collecting twigs. Families foraged together, both for efficiency and for the comfort of company. The act of searching itself became a kind of ritual, a daily journey outward, binding them to one another in their shared desperation. The diet shaped by this foraging was not only unfamiliar, but deeply transformative. Bellies grew distended, not from nourishment, but from the indigestible bulk of bark and acorn meal. Teeth ached from grinding hard foods, stomachs cramped with unfamiliar fibers. The old meals of bread, meat and cheese seemed like luxuries from another life. Food was no longer a pleasure, but an ordeal, something to be endured as much as consumed. In the evenings, families gathered around the fire to chew slowly through bowls of bitter stew, children whining at the taste, parents forcing them to swallow. Silence often fell over these meals, for there was little to say. Each bite was both a victory and a reminder of loss. And yet, the act of eating together, however meager, held a trace of defiance. Hunger had driven them into the snow, but they returned, bringing back enough to share, enough to stretch another day. Over time, the forest itself bore the marks of this struggle. Stripped trees stood like ghosts, their bark missing in patches. Digging near hedgerows left scars in the earth, as though the land itself had been wounded. Acorn groves, once left for the pigs, lay bare, their treasures gathered by desperate hands. The very landscape became a reflection of famine, scarred and scraped, reduced to its bones just as the people were, and always, the foraging led back home, where the gathered scraps were boiled, ground or baked into shapes that only faintly resembled food. The act of cooking became alchemy, an attempt to turn bark into bread, leaves into soup, roots into sustenance. It was a fragile magic, one that could never last, but it bought time. Time was survival, and survival was all that mattered. The empty marketplace had shown that the old structures of trade and surplus had collapsed. Foraging in the snow revealed what replaced them, a raw and brutal dependence on the land, stripped of comfort or certainty. It was survival reduced to its simplest form, a daily search for anything that might keep hunger one step further away. The forest and fields yielded little, yet the villagers were not alone in their struggle against scarcity. Beyond the thresholds of their cottages, in byres and pens in low barns of wattle and patch, the animals of the household also endured the hunger of winter. Cows, sheep, goats and pigs, creatures that had so long sustained peasant families with milk, wool, meat and labour, now became both a burden and a dwindling lifeline. Their survival depended upon fodder, and fodder, like grain, was finite. In autumn, careful households had stacked hay in lofts, bundled straw, and set aside the remains of threshing to provide rough feed through the cold. Some gathered fallen leaves and stored them in heaps, knowing that goats and sheep might chew them when better options failed. Others collected turnips, cabbages, or mandel-like roots, storing them in earthen pits. Yet no matter the preparation, winter had a way of stretching longer than stores could endure, and each week the piles grew smaller. The animals ate constantly, their hunger as relentless as that of their masters. A cow required a staggering quantity of hay to endure the winter months, far more than most families could truly spare. Sheep and goats consumed less, but still demanded more than the meager fodder could provide. Pigs, who thrived on scraps and mast, fared worst of all once the forests were bare. Their rooting snouts found little beneath frozen soil, and their restless squeals echoed through barns at night, reminders that hunger gnawed at every creature within the village. The choice of what to do with livestock became one of the cruelest dilemmas of famine. To keep them alive was to expend fodder that might run out before spring, leaving both beast and family to starve together. To slaughter them early was to gain meat for a short while but lose the milk, wool, or future labor the animal might have provided. Peasants weighed these decisions heavily, consulting neighbors, sometimes priests, and always their own gnawing sense of survival. The first to go were often the pigs. Quick to fatten in times of plenty, they quickly became useless in famine, consuming too much and giving nothing in return once mast was gone. Families killed them in midwinter, salting what meat they could, though salt itself was costly and in short supply. The flesh offered a brief abundance, shared in solemn meals, but the relief faded quickly, leaving only the empty pen and the knowledge that the family's larder had shortened. Sheep followed when hay ran thin. A sheep could still yield wool in spring, and for that reason many were spared if possible, but hunger made mercy fragile. Their thin bleats carried across frozen fields, as if the animals themselves lamented their fate. Families butchered them sparingly, often beginning with the weakest, the ones whose ribs already showed through dull fleece. Their hides were tanned for rough garments, their bones boiled for broth, nothing wasted. Cows were the most difficult to lose. A milk cow was more than food. It was security, nourishment for children, a steady source of sustenance in ordinary years. To slaughter a cow was a last resort, a sign that famine had truly broken the household. Yet even cows could not survive without feed, and the sight of gaunt animals, their heads hanging low, udders dry, became increasingly common as the weeks dragged on. Families stretched what they had, chaff, straw, even dried reeds cut from frozen marshes, to keep them alive. Still many fell, collapsing in the byre, their carcasses dragged into the snow for hurried butchering before frost claimed the flesh. Goats, hardy and stubborn, endured longer than most. They chewed twigs and bark, foraged through snow for what scraps remained, and sometimes followed their masters into the forest, clambering over roots to nibble at anything green. Their survival instincts mirrored those of the people, but even goats could not live on nothing, and by late winter many herds had withered, leaving families bereft of their milk. The decline of livestock reshaped not only diet, but daily life. Children who once carried milk pails returned with them empty. Spinning wheels slowed as wool supplies diminished. Dung, once plentiful for manuring fields, grew scarce, threatening future harvests. The rhythm of peasant existence, woven around the care of animals, fell silent. Byres that had echoed with lowing, bleating and snorting became eerily still, their emptiness a constant reminder of famine's reach. The emotional toll of slaughtering animals cannot be overlooked. These creatures had names, temperaments and histories within households. A cow might have been with a family for years, her milk-feeding infants now grown. A piglet raised by children in summer might be killed by their father in winter, its squeals muffled against the snow. Each loss carried grief, though rarely spoken aloud, for grief itself seemed a luxury in the presence of hunger. Yet in quiet moments, as families huddled by the fire, memories of lost animals lingered, woven into the unspoken sorrow of famine. There were moments, too, of tension among neighbors. When one household slaughtered an animal, the smell of roasting or boiling meat drifted through the village, drawing envious glances. Families whispered about who still had livestock, who might soon butcher a cow, who perhaps had hidden stores of fodder. Theft was rare but not unknown. Hungry men were tempted by the sight of a fat sheep or a struggling cow tethered too near the woods. In such times, communal bonds strained, though churches and manorial courts sought to keep order, punishing theft harshly even when desperation was plain. By late winter, the decline of livestock was nearly universal. Villages that once bustled with bleating flocks and lowing herds became eerily quiet. Bones lay in middens, hides cured stiff against barn walls, and children learned to do without milk or cheese. The animals that survived were gaunt shadows of their former selves, their survival no more assured than that of their masters. And as the villagers gnawed bitter bark bread or ladled thin nettle soup, they did so with the knowledge that what little remained of their herds and flocks could vanish as quickly as the frost beneath the sun. In the slow decline of livestock, famine revealed its full cruelty. It consumed not only the present but also the future. Each animal lost meant fewer chances for recovery when spring finally came, fewer calves or lambs to rebuild herds, fewer hands of strength to plow fields or pull carts. Survival today meant hardship tomorrow, and every choice was a gamble, one in which the house of hunger always seemed to hold the higher card. And so the villagers pressed on, their barns emptier, their fields bare, their fires fueled by sorrow as much as wood. Hunger lingered not only in their stomachs but in the silence where once their animals had lived, a silence broken only by the sighing wind through stripped trees and the faint toll of the church bell in the distance, reminding them that life continued, however diminished, beneath the unyielding sky of winter. Inside the peasant's dwelling, winter pressed as heavily as it did outside. The cottage, built of timber, wattle, and daub, with a thatched roof that sagged under snow, was never designed for comfort so much as for survival. Its single room served as kitchen, bedroom, storage, and shelter for all the members of a family, sometimes even for their most valuable animals. The bitter cold was not shut out but only softened, its presence felt in the draughts that slid through cracks in the walls, in the damp rising from earthen floors, and in the hoarfrost that formed at night on the insides of shutters. The hearth, a shallow pit or rough stone enclosure at the center of the room, provided the only real warmth, yet firewood itself was scarce. In summer and autumn, villagers had gathered sticks and cut timber from the Lord's woods, often under strict regulations, for trespassing into royal or noble forests risked heavy fines or worse. With famine came greater need, and what fuel had been stacked was already burning too quickly. Ashes built up in the hearth, smouldering more than blazing, so the warmth seldom reached the corners of the room. Smoke clung to the rafters, for chimneys were rare luxuries. Most cottages vented through small holes in the roof or cracks in the thatch, leaving the air thick and acrid, eyes stinging, lungs heavy with soot. Children huddled nearest the fire, wrapped in patched cloaks or the rough wool of old blankets. They stretched their hands to the warmth, though fingers remained cold, their nails bluish in the dim light. The elderly sat back, sometimes coughing from the smoke, sometimes silent in weariness. Mothers stirred thin pottages with wooden spoons, the steam faint and almost transparent, while fathers carved tools or mended harness straps, trying to distract themselves from the gnawing of empty stomachs. The scent within the cottage was a mixture of many things: damp thatch, smoke, human bodies pressed close, and above all stored hay. Families often brought their most vulnerable livestock indoors in winter, particularly young goats, lambs or chickens, to preserve them against the cold and theft. The mingling of beasts with humans was not unusual, yet in famine years it was more pronounced, for animals became too precious to leave outside. The hay stored for their bedding or feed filled the room with its dry, musty odor, mixing with the sourness of stale straw underfoot and the sharper tang of manure. Meals, when they came, offered little variety. Bread grew darker, denser, more bitter as acorns or bark were mixed into dwindling flour. Pottage, once thick with beans, peas or bits of salted pork, was now little more than hot water flavored with nettles or onion peel. The repetition dulled the appetite. Children ate slowly, sometimes crying at the bitterness, sometimes refusing until coaxed. Parents had little patience for refusal. Hunger did not leave room for choice. Eating was not pleasure, but ritual, a necessity as mechanical as breathing. Light in the cottage was scarce, with only the fire's glow and at times the faint flame of a tallow candle. Tallow itself was made from the rendered fat of animals, and with herds slaughtered early or starved, candles grew rarer as the famine deepened. Evenings stretched long in shadow, the day's work curtailed by darkness. Families sat in half-light, telling stories, praying, or simply waiting for sleep. Time slowed, each night indistinguishable from the next, punctuated only by the tolling of church bells in the distance or the sudden howl of wolves outside. The cold shaped the rhythm of rest as much as hunger shaped the rhythm of meals. Families often slept close together for warmth, wrapped in whatever cloth or fur they possessed. Straw mattresses, thin and damp, offered little insulation, and frost crept along the walls by morning. The act of rising each day became a trial, with the shock of air biting against bare skin and stiff limbs. Still they rose because life demanded it, and even in famine there were animals to tend, wood to gather, and fields to check. The cottage also carried a weight of silence. Conversations grew shorter, voices muted by weariness. Laughter, once common in autumn evenings when cider and ale flowed, fell away. Even children, restless by nature, learned quietness, conserving their strength, sitting with wide eyes in the smoky gloom. The sound most often heard was the crackle of the fire, the rattle of coughs, or the groaning of timbers under the weight of snow. For many, prayer filled this silence. Families recited paternosters before their meager meals, thanking God for food even when it was bitter or barely sufficient. Icons or crosses, hung upon rough walls, seemed to take on new meaning in those cold months, as the faithful asked for deliverance, for spring, for mercy. The church remained central, but within the cottage faith became a private practice, woven into daily survival. The bitterness of cold and scarcity also pressed upon the body. Malnutrition weakened resistance to chill. The smallest draught seemed sharper, the damp more penetrating. Children grew thin, their cheeks hollow, their limbs frail. The elderly found movement more painful, and many succumbed not directly to hunger, but to fevers, chills and weakness brought by the long winter. Each loss was marked quietly, a body carried from cottage to churchyard, a mound of earth rising among many others. Yet, even in such bleakness, there were small acts of endurance. Mothers mended clothes again and again, patching holes with scraps, ensuring children's feet were bound against frost. Fathers carved simple toys from wood to distract restless little ones, shaping animals from memory of those no longer in the barn. Neighbors, though strained themselves, sometimes shared a portion of broth or kindling with those worse off, preserving the fragile thread of community. These gestures did not banish famine, but they kept despair from consuming all. The bitter cold within the cottage was not merely physical, but symbolic, a reflection of a world narrowed to survival. Each detail, the smoke, The hay, the sameness of meals, the silence, spoke of a life endured rather than lived, suspended between hope and exhaustion. The walls enclosed not only bodies but the very experience of famine, a private theatre where hunger, cold and faith played their unending parts. And as the long nights stretched on, with the fire burning low and the wind whispering outside, families lay close, their breath mingling in the shadows, waiting for dawn, and for whatever fragment of sustenance the new day might bring. As the winter dragged deeper, and as the cupboards grew hollow, the famine ceased to be an external presence and became an internal one. It no longer lived only in empty barns, bare forests or cold cottages. It took residence within the human body. Hunger began to shape not only the routines of daily life, but the very appearance of villagers, their gestures, their gait, and their speech. The medieval world had a word for this transformation, sometimes calling it fames in Latin, sometimes speaking of it as a hunger sickness, an affliction as real as plague or fever, though slower, quieter and more drawn out. The earliest sign was fatigue. Tasks that had once seemed ordinary, fetching water, gathering wood, tending the fire, now left limbs trembling and breath uneven. Children, normally restless in their play, grew listless, sitting for long hours by the hearth, too weak to chase each other in the snow or help in small chores. Adults moved with heaviness, their bodies conserving energy, as if each step were too costly. The rhythm of village life slowed, not by choice but by necessity, as hunger hollowed out vitality. Stomachs bloated strangely, especially among children, the body responding to prolonged malnutrition by swelling with fluids. Legs and ankles puffed, joints ached, and ribs pressed sharply against thinning skin. Teeth loosened in gums, hair thinned, and wounds that once healed quickly lingered, oozing and festering. Though villagers lacked the modern language of vitamins or protein, they recognized the pattern, speaking of bellies swelling as if with evil winds or bodies becoming watery when fed too long on poor food. They understood that bark bread, acorns or bitter nettle soup filled the stomach, but did not truly sustain. Some ailments were blamed on imbalance within the humors. The medieval medical worldview, inherited from Galen and elaborated in monastic infirmaries, interpreted illness through the lens of hot and cold, moist and dry, blood and bile. Hunger, they thought, disturbed these balances, leaving the body weak to outside corruptions. Parish priests sometimes preached that famine was both a test and a punishment, but even secular observations noted that hunger seemed to breed sickness of its own, a slow wasting that touched all but the most fortunate households. The psychological toll of hunger sickness was as profound as the physical. The constant gnawing in the stomach never fully abated, even after meals, since those meals lacked substance. Sleep became restless, disturbed by dreams of bread or visions of feasts remembered from years of plenty. The mind wandered easily, distracted by the thought of food, and irritability grew. Families sometimes quarreled over portions, mothers anguished when children begged for more than could be given, fathers bitter at their inability to provide. Silence often followed such moments, heavy and shameful, for blame could not be assigned when all were equally caught in the grip of famine. Those who were weakest, the very old, the very young, succumbed first. Infants lost to milk starvation, their mothers themselves too malnourished to produce. Elders wasting quietly in the corner, their once steady hands trembling until sleep one night turned permanent. Such deaths were not always sudden but gradual, stretched across weeks, each day showing a deeper hollowness in the cheeks, a further dimming of the eyes. The hunger sickness was not uniform, for bodies resisted differently. Some grew skeletal, with bones pressing stark beneath skin. Others swelled grotesquely, legs and bellies distended as fluids collected where strength had fled. Still others carried hidden weakness, faintness, dizziness, sudden collapse in fields or by the fire. All shared a weariness that no rest could cure. Even laughter, when it occasionally emerged, sounded brittle, without the fullness of true joy. Descriptions from medieval chronicles, particularly during the Great Famine of 1315-1317, note that people became so feeble they could scarcely stand, and that many walked as shadows, their flesh gone, their faces pale and hollow. Monks recorded swelling as a common sight, remarking that bellies looked unnaturally round while limbs shrank. While physicians of the time lacked the concept of edema or kwashiorkor, their observations were nonetheless sharp. They recognized hunger as a disease in itself, with its own visible marks upon the body. The hunger sickness also altered the cycle of illness. Malnourished villagers became more susceptible to fevers, coughs and infections that swept through smoke-filled cottages. A simple chill could deepen into pneumonia, a small wound into a festering sore. Diseases of the skin, rashes, boils, eruptions, multiplied, for the body had little defense left. In this way, famine acted as both direct and indirect killer, weakening the body so thoroughly that any other malady might finish what hunger began. And yet, even amidst this slow decline, villagers persisted. They sought remedies where they could, boiling herbs to soothe swollen limbs, pressing poultices of warm cloth to aching joints, reciting prayers to saints known for healing. Rock, protector against plague and sickness, was invoked often, as was Saint Anthony, associated with the poor and suffering. But the cures were mostly symbolic, for no prayer nor potion could supply what was truly lacking: bread, meat, milk, sustenance. The hunger sickness became the new condition of life, a state endured rather than treated. It reshaped the calendar, for the usual feast days and celebrations seemed hollow when bodies were too weak to dance, too weary to sing. Work slowed not only in the fields but in crafts, weaving, and repairs, for hands trembled and backs ached. The famine was written on every gesture, every silence, every glance toward the horizon, as if spring might arrive sooner, by will alone. Within the cottage, the sickness was both visible and unspoken. Parents tried not to comment on the hollowness of their children's faces, or the swelling of their bellies. Children asked fewer questions as weakness dulled their curiosity. Hunger became a shared secret, as obvious as smoke in the rafters, yet rarely named aloud. It was endured quietly, for to give it words was to acknowledge its power, and outside, in the churchyard, the graves multiplied. Each new mound of earth told the same story, one of bodies undone, not by sword or plague, but by the slow grinding illness of want. The hunger sickness left no family untouched, no village unscarred. It lingered as a memory long after, shaping how peasants thought about plenty and scarcity, how they remembered winter, and how they prayed for harvest. The famine had stripped the forests and emptied the barns, but now it stripped the very flesh from the bone, hollowing not just bellies but lives. And as the weeks dragged on, and as frost still clung to the hedgerows, the hunger sickness deepened, ensuring that spring, even if it came, would not restore all who had endured the bitter cold. When hunger reached the stage of sickness, when fatigue dulled every movement, and the villagers' cheeks grew hollow, one item returned again and again to the center of their lives: bread. In the medieval imagination, bread was not simply food but sustenance itself. To lack bread was to lack life, and famine forced communities into the bleak experiment of reshaping this staple out of whatever materials could be gathered and ground. Thus emerged the bread of desperation, loaves baked not from good wheat or rye, but from husks, weeds, straw, bark, and acorns, dark and bitter, a parody of the food that had once filled their tables. Wheat was the grain most valued, producing soft white bread enjoyed by nobles, and in rare moments of abundance, by townsfolk of means. Rye, oats and barley were more common among peasants, hearty and sustaining, though often coarse. Yet even these lesser grains could not be relied upon in the bitter winters of famine years. Poor harvests, mold in storage bins, and the demands of landlords stripped much of what would have been milled into flour. What remained had to be stretched, made to last longer than it was ever meant to. At first, stretching meant mixing grains together, rye with barley, oats with peas. But as scarcity deepened, the additions grew stranger. Husks, normally discarded during threshing, were swept back into the meal, hard fragments that scratched the tongue and made the bread gritty. Straw, finely ground, was added for bulk. Sawdust from split logs found its way into the miller's stones, leaving a pale, fibrous dust that could be baked into loaves. Acorns were boiled to leach their bitterness, then dried and ground into a mealy powder. Even bark, stripped from young trees, dried and pulverized, could provide a kind of flour substitute, though it made the loaves taste woody and left splinters between the teeth. The resulting bread was dense and heavy. Its color, dark gray, or nearly black, announced its poverty before a bite was taken. The crust often burned quickly, while the interior remained damp and gummy. The taste was bitter, sometimes sour with a lingering aftertaste that could churn the stomach. Eating it was not a comfort but an ordeal, endured with clenched jaws and little conversation. Children gagged, elders winced, but all swallowed, because to refuse was to face emptiness. Medieval chroniclers recorded how such bread damaged the body. The fragments of husks and bark were harsh on the gut, leading to cramping and diarrhea, which in turn weakened the already malnourished body. Further, the lack of true nutrients meant bellies remained distended, skin pale, and limbs weak. Yet the bread at least provided the illusion of fullness, a heaviness in the stomach that allowed one to endure another day. There was a bitter irony in this parody of sustenance. Bread was at the heart of religious life, central to the liturgy and to the meaning of community. The Eucharist itself sanctified bread, transforming it into the body of Christ, making the loaf sacred as well as practical. But famine bread twisted this symbol. Instead of the divine made flesh, it represented deprivation made tangible, a reminder, with each bite, of the distance between what should have been and what was endured. Some priests framed this as a test of humility, a lesson that bread was not guaranteed, but given by God's mercy. For the peasants chewing on bark and weeds, such words offered little comfort. Villagers sometimes tried to disguise the taste. Honey, when available, could be drizzled to soften the bitterness, though honey itself was scarce in midwinter. Herbs, thyme, nettles, or mint, were sometimes boiled and mixed into the dough, their fragrance masking the sour smell. In some regions, especially where fishing still continued in icy waters, dried fish or fish oil was kneaded in, producing loaves with a pungent odor that lingered on the hands. Yet no addition could truly redeem the texture or the effect on the body. It was bread only in shape and ritual, not in spirit. The making of famine bread was also a communal act. In villages where ovens were shared, families arrived with their pitiful mixtures of bark, straw, and grain. The loaves that emerged were distinguishable by smell and color, but all shared the same grim resemblance. Women who bore the burden of transforming scraps into meals often carried the shame of producing loaves their children could barely swallow. Chroniclers describe mothers in tears when children spit out the dark bread, urging them to eat for survival's sake, even when they themselves struggled to force it down. Over time, the bread hardened into memory, becoming one of the clearest symbols of the famine years. Long after the hunger eased, peasants recalled the black bread, or the bark bread, speaking of it with a mixture of revulsion and sorrow. To eat such bread was to have looked famine in the face, and lived, though never without scars. Medical texts of the late Middle Ages even warned against such breads, noting their indigestibility and their tendency to corrupt the stomach. Yet the warnings were meaningless when choice was absent. Survival demanded not nutrition but endurance, and the bread of desperation was the vehicle for that endurance. It left scars on the body, bloated bellies, wasted limbs, aching bowels, but it prolonged life, however meager. In this way, bread became both salvation and torment. Each loaf represented a triumph of resourcefulness, the ability of families to transform the inedible into something chewable. Yet, each loaf was also a reminder of loss, the loss of true harvests, of nourishing meals, of the joy once found in breaking bread together. The staff of life had become the weight of suffering, yet it was clutched tightly because nothing else remained to hold. And as villagers forced down these loaves, they would look out at the snowbound fields, where no wheat or rye would grow until spring, and wonder whether their bodies, weakened by such food, could hold out long enough to see green shoots again. The bread filled their stomachs, but not their strength, carrying them only part way through the winter's grip. When the loaves of bark and straw failed to keep bodies alive, when swollen bellies and sunken cheeks became too heavy a burden for frail frames, the quiet work of winter turned to burial. Death in famine years was not sudden and chaotic, as in times of plague or war, but gradual, lingering, and almost unremarkable. People slipped away in their cottages, an elder wasting after weeks of weakness, a child too malnourished to survive a fever, a mother fading after childbirth when her body had nothing left to give. The village learned to recognize the signs, the shallow breath, the fixed gaze, the hand no longer able to rise to the mouth. The act of burial in winter carried its own hardships. The earth itself resisted. The ground was frozen hard, locked under layers of snow and ice, each inch requiring iron tools and the strength of men already weakened by hunger. A grave that might have taken a few hours in summer could take a day or more in January, with pickaxes ringing against soil that felt like stone. Villagers often worked in shifts, pausing to breathe into their hands, rubbing numb fingers before returning to the stubborn ground. The sound of metal striking frost-bitten earth echoed through churchyards like a dull bell, each strike a reminder that death was not waiting but already among them. Coffins were rare in such times, reserved for the wealthier few or the clergy. Most burials took place in simple shrouds, wool, if a family could spare it, or linen, if any remained. Often poor households had little to wrap their dead in but rough cloth or old garments. A child might be laid in a basket, an elder swaddled in blankets worn thin by years of use. The rites were not abandoned, for the church insisted on the order of Christian burial, but they were shortened, made modest, the words spoken quickly in the cold air, as villagers stood shivering around the grave. The toll of malnutrition made these funerals frequent but muted. Grief was real but restrained, for families could not afford to collapse into mourning when survival demanded constant labor. Tears froze on cheeks, sobs were muffled under layers of wool, and silence followed. The community absorbed the losses in a subdued rhythm, each burial blending into the next, until the churchyard seemed to grow crowded with new mounds of snow-covered earth. Monastic chroniclers wrote of famine years when churchyards overflowed, when new pits were dug hastily along the walls, when the dead outnumbered the space available. In 1316, for instance, some English parishes recorded burials at 3 or 4 times the usual rate. In the worst-struck villages, bodies were laid together, side by side, because the ground was too hard, and the living too few to manage separate graves. Such practices carried no disgrace, only the recognition that necessity outweighed custom. The church bells tolled with a frequency that was itself unsettling. In ordinary years, the bell marked the passing of an elder, a rare misfortune, or the end of an illness. But during famine winters, the sound became a part of daily life, ringing not with shock but with inevitability. Some villagers stopped counting how often they heard it, while others prayed more fervently, crossing themselves each time, as if warding off the same fate. Children were often the most visible losses. Their small bodies could not withstand the rigors of malnutrition, and mothers carried them tenderly to the churchyard, their faces grey with exhaustion. Chroniclers note that famine years left behind generations marked by smaller cohorts of youth, entire age groups diminished by hunger. Elders too slipped away quickly, their bodies unable to recover once strength was lost. Families often described their deaths as gentle, not because the pain was less, but because the wasting was gradual, a candle burning out rather than being blown away. Illness carried many others to the grave. Hunger sickness weakened resistance, making influenza, dysentery, and respiratory infections all the more deadly. In cottages thick with smoke and damp air, coughs rattled through weakened lungs until silence replaced them. Priests who moved from home to home, bringing last rites, grew weary with the repetition. Their Latin prayers spoken with a kind of resigned cadence, more ritual than fervent plea. Despite the exhaustion, ritual persisted. The Christian burial service provided structure in a season where much else felt uncertain. The body was sprinkled with holy water, prayers were said for the soul's safe passage, and candles flickered in the dim light of the nave. Even in hunger, families scraped together offerings for the priest, sometimes in the form of eggs, ale, or firewood, if no coin was available. These rites were not mere superstition, they were a way of holding on to dignity, of affirming that even in famine, each life was worth a prayer. The churchyard itself became a quiet record of famine. Snow covered the fresh graves, smoothing the mounds into a silent white field, but beneath lay the story of a community thinned by want. In spring, when thaw revealed the dark earth again, families would walk among the markers, some carved, most simple, and remember not only individuals but the winter itself, the winter when hunger hollowed out their homes. For those who survived, These burials left scars. Parents remembered the loss of children for decades, retelling the winters of famine to younger generations as cautionary tales. The memory of digging frozen ground stayed in the muscles of those who labored at it, while the tolling of bells haunted the silence of later years. Famine was not only hunger, it was the shadow cast by empty chairs at the hearth, and by the growing rose in the churchyard. The burial in winter was not an end, but part of the ongoing rhythm of survival. Each grave dug was also a reminder to the living that their own strength was fragile, that each day's meager bread and broth might be all that stood between them and the same frozen earth. And when the men lowered their tools after striking at frozen soil, when the last prayer was spoken, and when the snow was shoveled back into place, they returned to cottages where hunger still gnawed, and where death was not finished with its work. After the burials, after the earth had been pounded shut, and the priest's words had faded, what lingered in the air of famine villages was not only grief, but rumor. In winters when hunger hollowed out the cottages and left the living gaunt, information, true or false, became another form of sustenance. Words passed from lips cracked with cold, whispered over low fires, repeated by travelers trudging down frozen roads. They carried the suggestion that elsewhere, somehow, food still existed. The whispers came in many forms. Some told of distant villages where barns remained full, where harvests had not failed so completely, where bread was still baked from wheat rather than bark. Others spoke of monasteries, their stone walls protecting storehouses of salted fish, dried beans and ale. The reputation of monasteries as places of charity fueled these tales, for it was known that monks, bound by vows of hospitality, distributed alms in times of want. The idea that one might walk for a day or two and find relief kept hope alive, even when the snow was deep and bodies weak. But not all rumors were hopeful. Alongside tales of abundance came warnings of danger. Some said that nobles hoarded grain in their castles, selling it only at impossible prices, or withholding it entirely to keep their own tables full. Stories spread of carts waylaid by hungry men, of bandits who prowled the roads, of wandering poor so desperate they took to stealing from cottages as gaunt as their own. Hunger not only thinned the body, but frayed the social fabric, and rumors captured this unease. The uncertainty of famine years made villagers especially vulnerable to believing such whispers, with no letters to confirm news, no stable channels of communication. Hearsay was all they had. A single traveler could alter the mood of an entire village, recounting what he had seen or claimed to see on the road behind him. His words might be shaped by truth, or by fear, or by the need to trade a story for a meal. Each listener then repeated the tale, reshaping it in the retelling, until it became difficult to distinguish fact from invention. Yet even if they were unreliable, the rumors mattered. They gave villagers a framework to imagine their place in the wider world. Hunger did not isolate them entirely, it bound them to the fates of others, to know, or believe, that another village had more, that a monastery might open its stores, that nobles grew fat while peasants starved, was to locate oneself in a larger story of inequality, chance, and divine favor or disfavor. Some set out in search of these whispered places of plenty. Families too weak to survive another week sometimes risked the road, following rumors of grain for sale at distant markets. The journeys were dangerous. Snow-covered roads slowed their steps, cold drained their strength, and the reality of scarcity often meant disappointment. Villages rumored to have grain proved as barren as their own. Monasteries overwhelmed by beggars sometimes closed their gates. Those who returned brought not only their own weary bodies, but new tales of hardship, feeding the cycle of rumor again. Monks themselves recorded the flood of wanderers during famine years. Chronicles from the early 14th century describe roads filled with beggars, refugees from hunger, who drifted from parish to parish, seeking relief. To those who remained in their own villages, the sight of these travelers became living rumor, visible proof of distant misery. A gaunt face arriving at the cottage door told a story as effectively as words, and it suggested that no place was safe from the famine's reach. There were also whispers darker still. Stories circulated of thefts within villages, of grain stolen from storage bins in the night, of animals disappearing from sheds. Sometimes the tales named no culprits, sometimes they blamed strangers, and sometimes quietly, behind closed doors, they accused neighbors. In famine years, suspicion grew easily, for the line between survival and betrayal was thin. Rumors of theft or hoarding could poison the fragile trust that held communities together. Even more unsettling were tales of cannibalism, whispered rarely, but with enough force to leave an impression. Chroniclers of the Great Famine recorded such stories of parents forced to eat their children, of bodies dug from graves, of strangers killed for meat. Whether such acts truly occurred, often or only in scattered, desperate cases, is debated, but the rumors themselves traveled far. Their power lay less in their accuracy than in the fear they stirred, that hunger might drive people past the boundaries of humanity. Amid all these whispers, hope clung stubbornly. If a monastery's gates opened in one region, word traveled far beyond it, inspiring others to believe aid might come to them as well. If a noble distributed grain in charity, his reputation grew, sometimes exaggerated into legend. These stories, even when only partially true, kept despair from becoming total. To believe in the possibility of relief was itself a form of endurance. And so, in cottages where smoke curled weakly from the hearth, where the bread was black with bark and the children's bellies swelled with hunger, people leaned close to share rumors. The words warned them in a way food could not. They carried images of barns filled with grain, of fish drying in monastery kitchens, of bread baked golden and soft. And though reason often told them such stories were illusions, they listened, repeated, and hoped. For in famine, the body needed bread, but the spirit needed whispers to keep walking through the snow. Behind high stone walls and heavy wooden gates, while villagers starved in the snow, grain lay stored in the barns and granaries of the nobility. These storehouses, massive timber-framed structures with raised floors to keep out damp, their bins filled after harvest, stood as both lifeline and symbol of power. In the social hierarchy of medieval Europe, the manor was not only a place of authority, but of control over food itself, and during famine years, that control was made brutally visible. The lord of the manor did not plant or reap his own fields. Peasants and serfs worked the land, owing labor, rents, and portions of their harvest to him. A part of that harvest was collected as dues: sheaves of wheat, sacks of rye, barrels of oats, even hens or cheese. In times of plenty, this arrangement, though often resented, was tolerated. The lord, after all, offered protection, justice, and patronage in return. But in times of famine, when the villagers' stores were depleted and their children weakened by hunger, they knew that much of the food they had grown still sat behind locked gates at the manor. What the lord chose to do with that grain was a matter of strategy, self-preservation, and at times morality. Some lords sold their reserves at inflated prices, exploiting scarcity to enrich themselves further. Records from England and France in the years 1315–1317 describe the price of grain doubling, tripling, even quadrupling, as nobles rationed their stores into the market, ensuring their own profit, while the poor bartered livestock, tools, or even the roofs over their heads to buy a few measures of meal. Such practices deepened resentment, for hunger sharpened the awareness of inequality like little else. Other lords, wary of revolt, distributed small amounts of grain to their tenants. These alms were often meager, just enough to keep families alive for a few weeks, but they served to reinforce loyalty and reduce unrest. A wise lord understood that starving peasants were not only pitiable but dangerous. Chroniclers note that in regions where noble charity was entirely absent, theft and banditry grew rapidly, while in areas where even small amounts of relief were given, order endured longer. The storehouse thus became not only an economic tool but a political one, and a measure of the balance between generosity and control. Yet even when lords gave, the disparity remained glaring. Within the manor hall, the high table was never empty. Nobles and their households continued to dine on roasted meats, on white wheat bread, on spiced wine and ale. Though these meals were sometimes reduced in variety during the harshest winters, They remained unthinkably rich compared to the bark bread of the villages. Servants and retainers in noble households ate better than the peasants who had sown the very fields. Visitors to these halls in famine years sometimes recorded the contrast: the warmth of the fire, the smoke of roasting venison, the clatter of cups, while just outside, villagers bent low against the snow, carrying their dead to the churchyard. This divide was not lost on the people. The sight of a lord's storehouse, its bins swollen with grain, became a bitter image during famine. Rumors of hoarding grew sharper when smoke rose steadily from the manor kitchens while cottages went cold. To the hungry, the noble's wealth seemed not only unjust but unnatural, as though food itself obeyed a hierarchy, flowing upward to the few while leaving the many barren. At times, anger boiled into action. There are scattered accounts of peasants raiding storehouses, breaking open bins and scattering grain in desperate scrambles. Such uprisings were rare, for punishment was harsh and the risks great, but the fear of them haunted lords. Guards were posted at barns, gates reinforced and patrols sent out to watch the roads. Hunger was a force that neither stone walls nor armed men could entirely keep at bay, and nobles knew that charity, however minimal, was often cheaper than repression. Even monasteries, which held their own granaries, felt the tension. Their storehouses, though intended for both community use and charitable distribution, strained under the flood of beggars who came to their gates. Some abbots gave until their own monks began to feel the pinch, while others closed their doors, citing the need to preserve their spiritual community first. In either case, the villagers saw the same reality: food existed within reach, but access to it depended on power, status, and favor. The starkness of the divide during famine years left long memories. Ballads and stories that circulated afterward often painted lords as greedy hoarders, their wealth measured in the misery of their tenants. In the chronicles, we read of fattened barns and hollow cheeks, a phrase that captures both the visible abundance of the noble class and the emptiness endured by the peasantry. The famine thus became not only a season of hunger, but a season of sharpened awareness about inequality. Still, the peasants endured. They begged at gates, they bargained for scraps, they swallowed the bitterness of bark bread, while knowing that grain lay within reach, but not within right. Their lives continued under the shadow of the storehouse, each day a reminder that the wealth of the few dictated the survival of the many. And when spring finally came, when shoots of green returned to the fields, the memory of those locked barns lingered. It was a memory that deepened mistrust, that shaped future disputes, that taught peasants to see hunger not merely as a force of nature, but as a condition enforced by human hands. The noble storehouses, in their abundance and their gates, thus became one of the famine's most enduring images, symbols of plenty and of division, of survival and of injustice, standing tall in a winter where so many cottages grew empty. When the hunger grew too sharp, when the thin bark breads and nettle stews could no longer quiet the body's demands, some villagers made the painful decision to leave their homes. The storehouses of the nobility had been glimpsed but rarely entered, and charity at the manor gate was never guaranteed. Rumors of grain in distant towns, of monasteries distributing alms, of shrines where miracles might be granted, all began to spread as the famine deepened. It was from these whispers that the weary pilgrimages for relief began. The decision was never easy. To leave one's cottage in the depth of winter meant abandoning the small warmth of the hearth, the watch over livestock, the companionship of family. It meant walking on roads that had turned to ice, where snowdrifts swallowed the path and landmarks vanished beneath white silence. Yet for some, the choice was less a matter of courage than inevitability. To stay was to starve, and so a parent, a son, or sometimes entire families took to the road, driven not by wanderlust, but by the thin hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, food might be found. Pilgrimage in the medieval world was not unusual. In ordinary years, villagers sometimes walked for weeks to reach holy shrines, seeking cures for illness or forgiveness for sin, but famine gave pilgrimage a harder edge. Those who set out did not carry candles or tokens for offerings, they carried empty sacks, hoping to fill them with bread or grain. The lines between religious devotion and simple survival blurred, as prayers for miraculous intercession mingled with the practical desire for sustenance. Monasteries were often the first destination. Known as places of charity, Their gates were approached by long, shivering lines of the poor. Chroniclers record the scenes: thin figures in tattered wool, children with hollow cheeks, mothers clutching infants wrapped in rags. The monks, bound by vows of charity, attempted to distribute bread or pottage, yet their granaries too were not endless. Some abbeys gave freely until their stores dwindled, others rationed carefully, handing out only crumbs, and still others closed their gates, overwhelmed by the endless flood of supplicants. For those turned away, the disappointment was crushing. To have walked for days only to receive a crust or nothing was a blow that some did not survive. The roadsides of famine years became littered with bodies, wrapped hurriedly in cloaks or left where they fell, a grim reminder of the risks such journeys entailed. And yet still they came, for desperation does not weigh risks in the same way as comfort does. Shrines too became focal points for relief seeking. In a world where hunger seemed to strike with divine force, people turned to the saints for intervention. Pilgrims huddled in chapels before relics, muttering prayers not for salvation of the soul, but for relief of the stomach. Some carried offerings, tokens carved of wood, or the last of their coin, in hopes of invoking miracles. Occasionally stories spread of healings or sudden provision, of grain appearing in a shrine's storehouse, or of children restored to health after prayer. Whether these were fact, rumor, or hope transfigured into tale, they encouraged further journeys, each pilgrim sustained as much by imagination as by bread. Towns presented another possibility, though they were dangerous in their own way. In ordinary years, markets bustled with trade; in famine years they fell silent. Still, towns attracted those who believed surplus might linger in merchant cellars or city granaries. The poor came in droves, their presence sometimes tolerated, often resented. Beggars filled church porches, narrow streets, and the edges of market squares. Some towns organized controlled distributions, overseen by guilds or councils, but many more turned the hungry away, fearing disorder, theft, and contagion. The tension between citizen and stranger sharpened, and fights sometimes broke out over scraps of food thrown into the streets. The pilgrimage for relief thus became not a single act but a pattern of movement across famine-stricken regions. Small streams of villagers leaving home, converging on monasteries, towns or shrines, and sometimes returning with scraps, sometimes not returning at all. For those left behind, each departure carried both hope and grief. A husband might walk to a monastery, promising to return with flour, while his family waited in the cold, counting the days until his figure reappeared on the horizon. Sometimes he came back thin but triumphant, carrying a sack of meal. Sometimes he did not come back at all. These journeys were remembered as both acts of faith and acts of desperation. Later storytellers would emphasize the piety, the barefoot pilgrim trudging through snow, his breath a prayer clouding the night air. Yet beneath the imagery lay the harder truth. The pilgrimages of famine were often driven less by devotion than by the simplest instinct of survival. They were prayers made with empty stomachs, steps taken on weakening legs, and a kind of wandering that reflected the breakdown of local stability. The roads bore witness to these movements. What had once been the paths of traders, or the occasional traveling friar, became lines of gaunt villagers, trudging slowly, their heads bowed not in reverence but in weariness. Inns, where they existed, rarely welcomed them. Cottages along the way could not afford to feed strangers. And yet, despite the hostility, despite the weather, despite the dangers, the pilgrimages continued. For famine was not merely endured in silence within cottages. It spilled out onto the land, scattering the hungry across the countryside in search of something, anything, that might preserve life for one more season. And when at last spring seemed near, when the snow began to soften, but the fields gave no early promise of relief, the journeys did not end. Instead, they grew more desperate, as travelers sought places where the thaw might come sooner, where the rumor of grain still lingered. The pilgrimage for relief was not a single path to salvation, but a wandering without end, a testament to how hunger could drive people far beyond the boundaries of their villages and into the wider landscape of uncertainty. While famine hollowed the bellies of men, women, and children, the forests beyond the villages carried their own restless hunger. The deep winter, which robbed peasants of their harvest, also stripped the woodlands of easy prey. Deer grew thin and scarce, hares vanished into burrows, and the smaller creatures that once sustained the predators either hibernated or perished beneath the snow. And so, drawn by need, wolves crept closer to the fragile human settlements, shadows at the edge of the tree line, their howls a haunting accompaniment to the famine silence. For medieval villagers, wolves were never wholly absent from the imagination. They prowled the edges of stories, of sermons, and of the wilderness that marked the limits of cultivated land. They were beasts of both flesh and symbol, creatures associated with danger, the devil, and the chaos that lay beyond the order of the ploughed field. In good years, when harvests filled barns and children laughed in the fields, wolves were distant threats, something to be spoken of in cautionary tales. In bad years, when food ran out, those tales seemed to step into reality. The famine years amplified this fear. Chroniclers of the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, particularly in France and Germany, noted that wolves ventured boldly into villages, scavenging on the outskirts, drawn by the scent of waste, and more grimly, by the unburied dead. The hard ground often prevented proper burial, and when bodies were laid shallow in frozen soil, or left at the roadside by pilgrims who could not carry them farther, wolves were among the first to find them. For the villagers, already weakened by hunger and haunted by mortality, to see or hear wolves feeding was a terrifying reminder of nature's mercilessness. The sound of wolves in winter was distinctive. On nights when the air was still and the snow carried sound, their howls traveled across valleys, rising and falling in eerie cadence. Families huddled near the hearth would fall silent when such cries reached them, listening with dread. A howl was not only a sound but a measure of distance. Far and faint meant the pack still roamed in the deep wood. Near and loud meant they lingered closer than comfort allowed. For children, the cry of wolves became fused with hunger itself, an outside echo of the growl that came from within. And yet wolves were not simply spectres of terror. They were also real, physical presences capable of violence. Records from medieval Europe describe incidents of wolf attacks during particularly harsh winters. Most often, they preyed upon livestock, slipping into folds where weakened sheep or calves provided an easier meal than deer in the forest. The loss of even one animal was devastating to a peasant household, for each cow or sheep was not merely meat but milk, wool, traction or trade. To hear wolves circling the livestock pen in the dark, their paws crunching on snow, their eyes glinting in torchlight, was to feel famine's grip tighten. On rarer, more desperate occasions, wolves turned to humans. Chronicles mention small children taken at the forest edge, woodcutters ambushed, and travelers attacked on lonely roads. Whether all such tales were literal or exaggerated by fear is difficult to say, but in famine years, the stories multiplied. A pilgrim lost in snow, a weak man collapsing by the roadside, a child left unattended at the edge of the village. These became the narratives that villagers passed along, each one reinforcing the sense that hunger now belonged not only to men but to beasts as well. Wolves also held a symbolic weight in the medieval mind. In sermons, priests spoke of famine as a divine scourge, and wolves became part of that image, predators sent to remind humanity of sin, creatures embodying punishment or the collapse of human order. In manuscript illuminations, wolves were drawn alongside skeletal figures of famine, twin emblems of nature's cruelty. The villagers, listening to these words within their cold churches, could not help but glance toward the forest afterward, as though the preacher's imagery lingered in the snow-cloaked tree line itself. Yet it was not only fear that wolves inspired, it was also a grim form of recognition. Both man and beast were starving, both driven into new and dangerous patterns of survival. The sight of a gaunt wolf, its ribs showing beneath its fur, was a mirror of the hollow-bellied peasant. The difference lay in strength and freedom. Wolves had sharp teeth and a forest to roam, while the villager had only weak limbs, brittle bread, and the confines of his fields. Hunger blurred the line between species, reducing both to desperate creatures clinging to life against the cold. Communities responded in practical ways where they could. Hunters laid traps though iron for proper devices was scarce. Organized wolf hunts were sometimes called by local lords, not only to protect livestock, but to assert control in times when the natural order seemed threatened. A successful kill brought a temporary sense of relief, the pelt displayed as proof of safety restored. Yet such triumphs were fleeting, for the pack was rarely far behind, and hunger in the forest was as relentless as hunger in the cottage. For the villagers, the memory of wolves at the edge of the famine winter endured long after the snow melted. Children who survived grew into adults who told stories of glowing eyes in the night, of bones found scattered near the tree line, of the way the wolves' howls had seemed to echo their own cries of hunger. The famine was not only remembered as a time of empty barns and strange breads, but as a season when the boundaries between human settlement and wild forest seemed to waver, when the beasts that usually kept to their own domain pressed into the fragile circle of village life. Thus the wolves of the famine winters became part of its lore, not merely animals but symbols of the peril that surrounded a community when scarcity closed in from every side. Hunger had many forms: gnawing in the stomach, emptiness in the fields, silence in the marketplace. But none were as haunting as the low, mournful howl that rose from the frozen woods, a sound that told the villagers they were not the only ones starving, and that survival was never certain, not for man nor beast. The famine winter always had its hardest weeks at the very end. By late February and March, the snow no longer fell in thick, enchanting drifts, but lingered in hard, grey patches across the fields, crusted over with ice that would not soften. The days lengthened, but without warmth. The sun rose earlier and set later, yet its pale light seemed unable to touch the ground, as if the world remained caught in some spell of endless barrenness. For the peasants, this final stretch was often worse than the beginning, not because of sudden catastrophe, but because of the slow erosion of every remaining reserve. By now, whatever had been carefully stored in the barns during autumn was nearly gone. The sacks of grain in the lofts had been opened and reopened, the bottom scraped bare with wooden spoons. The salted meat, once cut in cautious portions, had been gnawed to fat and bone, while the bones themselves were boiled until the broth gave no flavor at all. Root cellars had grown hollow, the turnips and onions soft with age or already consumed, the apples shriveled to sour skins. Rats, too, had been hungry, and more than one household discovered its last handful of grain ruined by their teeth. Meals, if they could still be called that, shrank to little more than ritual. A crust of bread divided among many hands, a thin gruel made with nothing but water, and the memory of oats, a bitter stew of dried nettles and ground husks. These were swallowed without ceremony. Children cried less often, not because they were content, but because their bodies had grown too weak to protest. The hunger sickness, which had appeared earlier in the winter, now became impossible to ignore. Bellies swelled while limbs withered, skin grew pale and tight, and weakness became a kind of constant companion. To rise from bed was an effort to fetch water from the frozen well, a monumental task. Illness peaked in these weeks. Malnutrition made bodies vulnerable to fevers, coughs, and the lingering agues of winter. The smoke-filled cottages, once a shield against the cold, became stifling traps for those whose lungs could no longer bear the thick air. Colds turned to pneumonia, wounds festered without healing, and even small ailments claimed lives already weakened by hunger. The churchyard, already dotted with shallow graves, grew crowded, though burials were delayed when the earth was too hard to break. In some places, corpses were kept in barns until the thaw allowed them to be laid properly to rest. It was during this last stretch that despair crept most strongly into the hearts of the people. Earlier in the winter, there had been determination, rationing, foraging, small acts of endurance. But now, when spring seemed near yet withheld its promise, the spirit of survival faltered. The fields remained barren under their crust of ice. No shoots of green appeared, no thawing rivulets ran through the meadows. The people looked outward for signs, and the absence of them was crushing. To rise each morning and see the same endless white was to feel that winter would never end, that hunger would never relent. Some tried to preserve morale through prayer. Church bells continued to ring, though fewer came to hear them. Priests spoke of Lent, of Christ's own fasting in the wilderness, framing the villagers' hunger as a form of spiritual imitation. But even such words wore thin, when faces grew hollow, and bones showed through skin. Faith could not always fill the stomach, and some turned their prayers not to saints or God, but to the earth itself, begging the soil to wake from its slumber. Others leaned on their neighbors. If one cottage still had a handful of meal, it was sometimes shared among several families. If one family had lost a member, their remaining food might be divided among survivors of another. Community bonds grew strained in these weeks, but they also became vital. Those who withdrew into isolation often fared worse, for loneliness was a hunger of its own. The villages that endured longest were often those where solidarity, however meager, continued to thread between households. Yet alongside these fragile bonds came suspicion. Whispers spread about who still had hidden stores, who might be hoarding, who might have stolen from the common barns. Children accused one another of sneaking food. Adults muttered darkly about neighbors whose cheeks looked less hollow than their own. The famine bred not only suffering, but mistrust, and in the bleak days before thaw, even friendship could bend under the weight of hunger. The landscape itself deepened the sense of despair. Forests lay bare and skeletal, the snow between their trunks trampled with old foraging tracks that led to nothing. The rivers remained sealed beneath ice, their surface dulled by months of frost. Roads, once routes of pilgrimages for relief, were now nearly empty, for few had strength left to travel. Silence dominated, broken only by the groaning of rafters under ice, or the mournful cry of wolves still prowling the margins. Even the birds, those small harbingers of spring, had yet to return, and their absence was felt as keenly as any shortage of food. And still, life clung on. Mothers rocked their infants, though their breasts had little to give. Fathers patched the thatch against winds that would soon soften, if only they endured long enough to see it. Children played half-heartedly in the snow with sticks, their laughter faint but real, in the smallest gestures drawing water, mending tools, keeping watch at night. The will to survive persisted, quiet and stubborn, even when the body was near collapse. It was this persistence that carried villages through the last stretch, for though the days felt endless, time moved nonetheless. Slowly, imperceptibly, the crust of snow began to thin, the air softened, and faint drips began to echo from eaves. But in the moment, none of this was certain. To those who lived through it, the final weeks of famine winter felt like a punishment without end, a trial with no reward, a silence that stretched beyond endurance. Only when the first rivulets began to run, when the first black soil appeared beneath retreating ice, did hope begin to flicker again. And even then, it was fragile, for the people knew that hunger did not vanish with the snow. The hardest weeks were past, but the struggle was not yet over. The end of winter did not come with sudden warmth or bright blossoms, but with small, almost hesitant changes that were at first easy to doubt. After months of silence, the first sign was sound, the steady dripping from eaves as snow began to melt, the trickle of water running through ditches, and the cracking of ice on rivers as they swelled with thaw. Roads that had been hard and frozen turned to mud, sucking at boots and wheels. But even this misery felt like a promise of life's return. Fields, long sealed beneath white, began to reveal patches of black earth. The sight of soil itself stirred something close to reverence. Men and women alike knelt to touch it with their fingers, though the ground was too wet and cold for planting. In some meadows, green shoots pushed cautiously through the thaw, fragile blades of grass and nettles that seemed miraculous after months of emptiness. Children too weak to play in winter picked these first plants with eager hands, their laughter returning, thin but real, to the village air. The rivers, now swollen with meltwater, carried away the stillness of winter. They rushed and roared, breaking free of ice, sometimes flooding low fields and washing out paths. Yet, even in their violence, they were a sign of change. Fishermen ventured again to their banks, nets in hand, though catches were meager and dangerous until waters calmed. The return of running water meant more than food. It meant motion, a reminder that the wheel of the year still turned. The people's bodies, however, remained fragile. The first edible greens, nettles, wild garlic, chickweed, sorrel, were gathered in handfuls, boiled into broths that tasted sharper and fresher than the famine stews of winter. These plants brought relief, but also a reminder of how much had been lost. Stomachs weakened by months of husks and famine bread struggled with the sudden richness of green food, and illness sometimes followed over-eager feasting. Even in relief, hunger had its risks. Villages took these first weeks of thaw as a signal to prepare. Plows, worn and rusted, were pulled from storage. Oxen, thin and stumbling, were yoked once more to the heavy wooden frames. Men leaned their whole weight behind the plowshares, straining against the sucking mud to break the earth. Women and children gathered seed, counting each handful as though it were gold, for planting too much too early could doom the harvest. Yet, waiting too long risked missing the narrow window of fertility. Every furrow turned was both a prayer and a gamble. With spring also came the return of movement beyond the village. Muddy roads filled with travelers again, peddlers selling salt or iron tools, beggars seeking alms, and messengers from towns bringing news of markets reopening. Rumors spread of where grain might be bought, though prices were often still impossibly high. Relief was not yet abundance, but the very sight of strangers on the road after winter's isolation brought a sense of connection to the wider world. The people greeted birds as though they were heralds. The call of a lark above the fields, the sight of geese flying north, the first sparrows nesting in the thatch, each was a living promise that life returned not only to the land but also to the air, where wolves had prowled all winter. Their howls grew fainter as prey returned to the forests, easing one shadow of fear even as others remained. Yet the first signs of spring carried fragility. Floods destroyed bridges, fields remained too sodden to sow quickly, and famine did not vanish simply because shoots had broken the soil. Many were still too weak to work their plots, some had already buried the very hands needed to sow the seed. Hope was tempered with caution, for all knew that the coming harvest, still months away, would decide whether the hunger truly ended or only continued. Still, to see the black soil, to hear the rush of rivers, to taste the sting of nettles boiled into soup, these were enough to stir life in bodies that had nearly given up. For a time even the weakest stood at the cottage doors to watch the thawing world, and in their eyes was something not seen since autumn, the flicker of hope. When the snow had melted, and the ground finally softened, the villagers faced the task that was both most necessary and most difficult, the planting of the New Year's crop. The hunger of the long winter had drained bodies of strength, yet it was in this very moment of weakness that labor was most urgent, for without seed in the ground there could be no promise of survival beyond another year of want. The soil, still damp from thaw, clung heavily to the plowshare. Wooden plows, their iron tips dulled by time, were dragged by oxen, whose ribs showed through thin hides. Some families had slaughtered their beasts in winter to keep children alive, and so the spring sowing was done with less animal power, more human effort. Men leaned forward into the harness, backs straining as they dragged furrows through fields that sucked at their feet with every step. The mud was thick, the air sharp with the lingering chill, and the earth seemed to resist their efforts, as though it too was slow to wake from the winter famine. The seed itself was measured out with painful care. Barley, oats, rye and wheat kernels were kept in small sacks, each handful weighed against the mouths it might have fed had it been baked into bread instead. This act of casting food into the ground required both faith and desperation, faith that the earth would return it multiplied, and desperation that left no other choice. To eat the seed was to shorten life by weeks, to plant it was to risk all in hope of harvest months away. Women followed behind the plough, scattering seed with a practiced rhythm, though each handful was thinner than in years past. Where once fields had been generously sown, now the kernels lay more sparsely, leaving the crop vulnerable to weeds and blight. Children drove crows and starlings from the furrows, shouting weakly, sometimes throwing stones, their own hunger reflected in their resentment of birds that stole what little could be spared. The planting season was also a time of ritual. The parish priest would often bless the fields, carrying a cross and sprinkling holy water over the soil while chanting prayers. This ceremony, part of rogation days in some regions, reminded villagers that the outcome of their toil lay not only in their labor, but also in the will of God. The people bent their heads as the prayers echoed across the muddy fields, a collective acknowledgement of both their vulnerability and their fragile hope. Even so, the weakness of famine lingered. Men fainted at the plough, women's hands trembled as they scattered seed, and children collapsed from fatigue in the furrows. The work was slower than in good years, the progress uneven, yet there was no possibility of waiting. Spring did not stretch forever, and to miss the sowing meant to forfeit the harvest entirely. Neighbors helped each other when possible, though each household jealously guarded its seed. The balance between charity and survival was narrow, dictated by necessity rather than kindness. As the weeks of planting passed, the village began to show signs of cautious renewal. Smoke rose more steadily from cottage chimneys as families boiled nettles, leeks and wild greens gathered from the hedgerows. The scent of fresh-turned earth replaced the smoke of burning peat. Birds called from the hedges, insects returned to the air, and the fields once again bore the sight of human labor stretched across their muddy expanse. Even in the weakness of hunger, there was movement, and movement itself felt like life. Still, danger lingered at the edges. Floodwaters sometimes drowned the lowest plots, washing away the thin scattering of seed. A late frost could burn young shoots before they emerged. Rumors of crop disease or infestations in nearby villages spread unease, though the people had little choice but to press on. The earth had to be trusted, even as it withheld, for no other source of food remained. In the evenings the weary returned to their cottages, hands blistered, bodies aching. Children who had spent the day chasing birds lay curled in straw, too tired even for hunger's complaints. The meager evening meals, thin pottage with a few foraged greens, were shared with quiet resignation, but also with the faintest thread of hope. Every seed buried in the soil was a promise, fragile yet vital, that the cycle of life might turn once more in their favor. The planting season, then, was not simply labor, but a collective act of endurance. It was the bridge between famine and possibility, the moment where suffering might begin to turn toward recovery. The villagers had survived the winter, though many had fallen. Now they placed their survival for the next year into the soil beneath their feet. And as the fields grew quiet at sunset, the furrows stretched across the land like lines of faith written in earth, waiting for rain and sun to decide their fate. The thaw had come, the seed was planted, and in time the fields would turn green again. Yet famine does not leave quietly when food returns. Hunger remained in the body, like a shadow, etched into ribs, swollen bellies, and the hollow gaze of those who had spent too many months living on bark bread and boiled weeds. More than that, famine settled into memory, shaping how whole communities thought of the world and their place within it. For even when harvests prospered again, the memory of want whispered beneath every loaf of bread. Children who had endured the famine would carry its lessons for life. Years later, when they had fields of their own, they salted meat more carefully, stored grain more tightly against rats, and eyed the skies with greater suspicion. They told their children of winters when the pot on the fire contained nothing but water and bark. They spoke of neighbors who had died before the thaw, and of wolves that had come to the very edge of the cottages. In these retellings, famine became not just an event, but a story passed from one hearth to another, a grim inheritance meant to remind younger generations that comfort was fragile. The church, too, wove famine into its rituals and sermons. Priests spoke of hunger as a divine test, a chastening of the flesh, to remind people of their dependence upon God. Special prayers for rain, for fertile soil, for protection from blight, became more fervent after famine years. In processions during rogation days, the blessing of fields was charged with deeper urgency, for everyone remembered too well the months when the earth had given nothing in return for their labor. Hunger sharpened devotion, not always from love, but from the fear of what silence from heaven might mean. Communities carried famine memory in their customs. In some places, households baked famine loaves once a year, mixing bark or weeds into bread, as a ritual reminder of what had been endured. In others, village councils set aside grain stores in barns controlled by the Lord or the church, an attempt to keep some measure of protection for the future. These acts were not always effective. Greed, poor harvests, or war could still scatter reserves. but the impulse to remember through preparation lingered. At the same time, famine deepened the divisions of society. Peasants remembered how lords and monasteries had responded in those lean months, who gave alms, and who turned away the hungry at their gates. In chronicles, some monasteries earned reputations for charity, while others were marked by whispers of hoarding and cruelty. Lords who distributed grain in times of want were remembered with respect, while those who withheld it found rebellion simmering when hardship eased. Famine thus shaped not only memory but also politics, as the people judged the morality of their rulers by their behavior in the season of scarcity. On a more personal level, famine altered the relationship people had with food itself. Bread, always the centerpiece of medieval life, became even more sacred. The careful crossing of loaves before cutting them, the gathering of crumbs, the refusal to waste even the smallest scrap. These customs were not mere piety, but habits carved by the memory of want. Meat, when it returned to tables, was savored with a reverence born of knowing how quickly livestock could vanish in winter. Even the simplest pottage was received with gratitude by those who had once survived on worse. Memory also had a way of extending fear. In the summers after a famine, when barns were once again full and markets bustled with trade, there was still an unease that lingered. A sudden frost in August, an outbreak of mold in stored grain, or a rumor of armies passing nearby could bring back the tightness in the chest that famine had taught them. Mothers rationed food longer than needed, fathers counted sacks of grain twice over, and old men at the church door shook their heads whenever harvest clouds looked too heavy or too light. The medieval chroniclers, often monks with ink-stained hands, preserved famine in their writings as both warning and lament. They described swollen corpses by the roadside, children abandoned by starving parents, and the eerie silence of empty villages. Yet they also recorded acts of endurance, a widow who survived by gathering nettles each day, a community that banded together to share their meager bread, a monastery that opened its stores until nothing remained but the trust in God. These stories became a kind of collective scripture of hunger, a reminder that the cycle of feast and famine was woven into the very fabric of the age. Even centuries later, the great famines of medieval Europe shaped identity. When later generations faced new shortages, they invoked the memory of earlier hunger as both caution and comfort. They told themselves, "Our ancestors endured worse, and so will we." At the same time, the memory of famine fed into fears of divine punishment, of human greed, and of the fragile balance between survival and collapse. The survivors of a famine rarely spoke of it with ease. Hunger had a way of hollowing not just the body, but also the spirit. Yet in the quiet moments, around the hearth in winter, or in the fields at planting time, the memory returned. A mother might warn her child to finish every scrap, for she remembered days when there was nothing. An old man might run his hand across a sack of grain, sighing with gratitude, for he knew what it meant to have none. These were not just recollections, but living reminders that survival was never guaranteed. In this way, famine lived on long after the snow had melted, and the fields turned green again. It shaped habits, sharpened prayers, altered politics, and bound communities together with shared scars. The memory of hunger was not just the echo of past winters, but a presence that lingered in every loaf, every seed, every prayer for rain. For in the medieval world, the people knew that famine could return with the turning of the seasons, and that memory was their only true defense against forgetting how fragile life had always been.